There is a flashback in the Season 6 premiere, and it unfolds slowly, threaded through several key scenes rather than over in a blink. A younger Rick Sanchez is standing in his garage with his wife and his little girl, and another version of himself is offering him the keys to the entire multiverse. And this Rick says no. He is happy. He has everything he wants. And for saying no, a bomb comes through a portal and takes his family from him in an instant. That one refusal is the reason our Rick exists the way he does. And it is the reason almost every other version of him ends up standing somewhere beneath him. Tonight we are going through every Rick who could actually beat him. The real ones, the pretenders, and the single one who genuinely did it. So settle in, turn the lights down low, and let your shoulders drop. We will be here a while. And if you have not subscribed yet, it honestly does help us keep making these. Before we can talk about who could beat Rick C-137, we have to be honest about how high the bar sits. Because the whole premise of this video only makes sense once you understand how far above the pack our Rick really stands. He is the character the writing calls the smartest man in the universe, at least within his own corner of the multiverse. And the later seasons do not settle that claim so much as complicate it, handing the real edge to a rival Rick and to a rival Morty instead. Not the smartest in a country, not the smartest on a planet, not even the sharpest inside a single reality, but the finest mind in a multiverse that is, by its own definition, endless. That is an absurd claim to make about anyone. The writers know it is absurd, and they keep daring you to find the exception. For most of those 9 seasons, by most accounts, nobody quite matches him. There is a running joke buried down inside the science fiction that the deadliest thing in all of creation is a bitter old man in a lab coat who has already decided nothing matters, and the tragedy underneath the joke is that he is usually right about both halves of that sentence. The title the fans and the writers give him is the Rickest Rick, and that phrase is carrying more weight than it looks like it is carrying. It does not merely mean he is a very Rick sort of Rick. It means he sits at the exact center of the structure that organizes every Rick, the structure we will circle back to again and again tonight. And his place at that center is neither an accident nor a coincidence. He is the reference point. Every other Rick is, in a sense, a copy or a variation of him, the standard the rest get measured against and mostly found wanting. So when you hear a Rick described as close to the center, or far from it, what that is telling you, under its breath, is how near that Rick comes to being ours. Almost none of them come near at all. His full name is given as Richard Sanchez, and the middle name most often cited is Daniel, though the sourcing there is thin enough that I would not swear to it in a courtroom, so let us just call him Rick and move along, because the name was never the point. The point is the resume. And laid out end to end, the resume is frightening, because it is not a list of gadgets and clever escapes. By most accounts, it is a record of victories over opponents who were built and assembled for the express purpose of ending him, though even Rick has come up short now and then, most famously against evil Morty, so let us not pretend the man is invincible before we move on. Start with the war, because the war is where the legend actually begins, and it matters more than anything else you could learn about him if you want to grasp why the answer to the title is so short. After he lost his family, our Rick built his own portal gun, the device that lets a person cross between dimensions, and he went hunting. He set out after the Rick who had murdered his wife and his daughter, and along the road he killed an enormous number of other Ricks. The lore describes the count in the language of dozens, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands, and the honest thing to admit is that nobody has a firm figure, but the scale is what lands. This was not a duel. This was a one-man extermination campaign that tore through reality after reality after reality. The war also tells you exactly who he is, in the way the other Ricks responded to it. They noticed. Of course they noticed. When one version of you is carving through the multiverse, killing every version of you he can reach, the rest of you tend to take it personally. So they organized. That alliance of Ricks, a great many of them, was not raised to hunt him down at all. It was a peace treaty he helped design himself, a truce struck with the very Ricks he had been killing, and only later, after a falling out over a seat he refused to take, did they brand him the rogue. And still he nearly wiped them out. The coalition that formed to destroy him could not destroy him. They lost so badly that the survivors did the only thing left to them. which was surrender. And then, in one of the darkest little jokes ever told at his expense, those surviving Ricks sat down with the Rick, who had just spent years slaughtering their brothers and built a society alongside him. They founded the Citadel with him. The people he had almost exterminated became his neighbors, because the alternative was to keep fighting him and keep losing. Hold on that for a second, because it reframes everything that follows. The Citadel of Ricks, that vast gleaming city packed with thousands of the multiverse's brightest minds, exists in part because a coalition of them tried to kill our Rick and failed so completely that forming a government with him became the more survivable choice. That is the bar. That is what you are trying to clear when you ask whether some other Rick could beat him. You are not trying to beat a man. You are trying to beat the man who already beat every other man who tried. Then there is the assassination squad, one of my favorite pieces of all this, because of how casually it gets dropped. At some point, an elite unit is sent after him, a specialized 5-Rick strike team, the best of the best, assembled for the single job of killing Rick C-137. 5 copies of the sharpest mind in the multiverse, coordinated, prepared, sent in together. He kills all 5. And the way he does it is almost insulting, because he takes control of the first assassin's body and turns that Rick's own weapons on the rest of the squad, so the unit built to end him is cut down by one of its own. The writing does not even make a production of it. It arrives almost as a footnote, a stray line of backstory, the sort of thing that in any other series would be a season's climax, and here is merely a thing that happened once. When a story treats the deaths of 5 elite super geniuses as a footnote, it is telling you where its main character sits on the ladder. He is not on the ladder. He is the wall the ladder leans against. Now carry it forward into episodes you have actually seen, because the backstory is one thing, but his ceiling gets put on screen in the present too. In the 3rd season premiere, our Rick is a prisoner. He has allowed himself to be captured by the Galactic Federation, the interstellar government that had seized Earth, and he is strapped into a machine meant to pull the secrets out of his own mind. From inside that trap, restrained, without a single gadget, apparently helpless, he engineers a victory about as complete as anything the series ever stages. He hijacks the machine, he hops from host to host, and he turns the Federation's own technology into a way to teleport an entire city of Ricks directly on top of the prison. He makes a battlefield out of his captors, and in the chaos he does 2 more things that would each be a career for an ordinary villain. He crashes the Federation's single galactic currency to nothing, which collapses their economy and dissolves their government almost overnight, and he settles an old debt with the Citadel by cutting straight through its leadership, killing the ruling council of Ricks down to the last man, spokesman included. He walked into a prison as bait and walked out having erased an intergalactic superpower and gutted the ruling council of his own kind, and he did it, more or less, because he was bored and wanted his garage back. That is the thing you keep running into with him. The feats are colossal, but the reasons behind them are almost always small and petty and human, and that gap is where the horror lives. He does not topple governments because he wants to rule them. He topples them because they inconvenienced him. He does not win because he is trying to save anyone. He wins because losing was never really on the table for him, and he knows it, and that certainty is a weapon all its own. And then, so you never mistake the gadgets for the man, there is the pickle. In the 3rd season, he turns himself into a pickle, an actual pickle, purely to duck a family therapy appointment, and the joke is meant to be that he has stranded himself, that he has stripped away his own hands and his own legs and left himself a helpless green thing on a table. Except the helplessness lasts only a few minutes. He builds a body out of cockroach and rat parts, he arms himself, and he cuts a path through a whole building of trained soldiers and an entire criminal syndicate, the whole time still a pickle. Under the spectacle, that episode is making a point about him in particular. Take away his tools, take away his limbs, reduce him to the least threatening object you can picture. He is still the most dangerous thing in the room, because the danger was never in the equipment. The danger is in the mind, and the mind travels with him wherever he goes, even into a pickle. So when we ask, across the next few hours, which Ricks could actually beat this man, we are not asking an idle question, and we are not asking a fair one. We are asking who could outthink the mind that outthought a coalition built to kill him, who survived a 5-man death squad of his own equals, who dismantled a galactic government from inside a chair, and who stayed lethal after being turned into a condiment. The honest answer, the one we will keep circling back toward, is that the list is astonishingly short, and that shortness is not a failure of imagination on the writer's part. It is the entire point. They built a machine, an actual structure inside the fiction, whose only job is to guarantee that a Rick like this always ends up on top. That machine is where we have to go next, because you cannot work out who could beat our Rick until you understand the game that was rigged in his favor before the fight ever began. The machine is called the Central Finite Curve, and once you grasp what it is, the whole question of this video changes shape, because you stop asking whether some Rick is strong enough to beat our Rick, and start asking whether the multiverse itself would ever permit it. The Central Finite Curve is the load-bearing idea of the entire cosmology, and yet it stays hidden for years, mentioned only in passing, until it is finally dragged into the light, and that reveal reframes everything that came before. So let me set it out slowly, because it rewards getting exactly right. The starting premise is that the multiverse is infinite, not large, not vast, but truly, mathematically infinite. An endless spread of realities in which every possible version of every possible thing happens somewhere. In a boundless multiverse, every Rick has a variant sharper than he is, and that variant has one sharper still, upward forever with no ceiling. Which means that in the honest, unedited multiverse, no Rick is special. There is always a better one somewhere out there. Intelligence, spread across infinity, stops meaning anything, because being the smartest is impossible when there is no largest number. The Central Finite Curve is the answer a group of Ricks devised to that unbearable fact. It is a wall. Not a physical wall, but a boundary drawn around a specific subset of the infinite multiverse. A curated selection of realities. And the rule that decides which universes get to sit inside the wall is a single line. Within the Central Finite Curve, Rick is the smartest being alive. Every universe where that is not so, every reality where a Morty is smarter, or where Rick never became a scientist, or where some other creature outstrips him, all of them are walled off on the outside. What is left inside is a filtered infinity, an infinity that has been carefully gerrymandered so that in each reality within it, the smartest thing alive is a Rick. Think about what that actually accomplishes. It means the Citadel, the Council, the whole civilization of Ricks and Mortys exists inside a pocket of reality engineered to make Ricks the top of every food chain. The reason a Rick gets to be the smartest thing in his universe is not that Ricks are naturally fated to win. It is that somebody drew a border around all the universes where Ricks win and threw the rest away. It is as Rick a thing to do as could exist when you turn it over. Faced with a cosmos that refused to make him special, a Rick simply trimmed the cosmos down to the part where he was. There is one detail that makes the whole thing land, a detail the research is very firm about and that I want to get exactly right. Our Rick C-137, was central to building the curve. He is not some innocent bystander living inside a rigged system that other Ricks constructed to trap him. He is one of the architects. The structure that guarantees Rick's supremacy across a filtered infinity was, in part, his own design. So when we marvel at how he sits at the precise center of it, the Rickest Rick, the reference point, we should remember that he helped draw the map that placed him there. The man who is impossible to beat helped write the rule that makes him impossible to beat. This is where I have to slow down and mark the line between what the series demonstrates and what I am reading into it, because this is the kind of idea that tempts you into overreach. What the series shows you is the structure, the wall, the rule, the fact that Ricks are curated into supremacy within it. The reading I am offering is that the Central Finite Curve is Rick and Morty's confession about its own lead. It is the story admitting, in the grammar of science fiction, that Rick's genius is not the triumph of an individual, but the product of a system he built to flatter himself. Read that way, the curve is not a plot device. It is a self-portrait. It is a lonely man who could not bear to live in a universe where he was not the most important thing, so he made a smaller universe where he always would be, and then spent the rest of his life miserable inside it. That is the argument, and I think it is the strongest reading of the whole series. But I want to flag it plainly as a reading and not slip it in as a fact. Now, what does the curve mean for our real question tonight? The question of who could beat C-137. It means two things, and they pull in opposite directions, which is exactly what makes it interesting. The first is that inside the curve, beating our Rick is close to structurally impossible for most challengers, because the entire environment is tuned to keep a Rick, and specifically the central Rick, on top. Any Rick who lives within that filtered infinity is, by the rules of the place, not going to be meaningfully sharper than the reference Rick, because the reference Rick is the reference. That is what central means. So the roster of Ricks who could beat him from inside the curve is, almost by definition, close to empty. The system was built to keep it empty. The second thing it means is more unsettling, and it is the thread that runs through the back half of the series. If the curve keeps Ricks on top, then the true danger to a Rick was never going to arrive from another ordinary Rick inside the wall. It was always going to come from outside it, or from someone willing to break the wall altogether. And that is precisely what happens. Someone punches a hole in the Central Finite Curve. Someone walks out through it into the unfiltered multiverse, the honest infinity, where Ricks are not promised the win. And the one who does it, who finally exposes the whole rigged game and cracks it wide, in the 5th season finale, is not a Rick at all. It is a Morty. We will get to him, and to what it means that the being who broke Rick's supremacy was not one of the Ricks it was built to protect. For now, hold the shape of the idea, because it changes how you count. When you ask who could beat C-137, the curve tells you to stop searching among the Ricks. It was built to make sure the answer was not there. There is one more consequence of the curve worth staying with, because it deepens the tragedy of every lesser Rick we are about to meet. If every universe inside the wall is one where Rick is the sharpest mind alive, then every Rick inside the wall is, in a sense, a slight variation on a theme our Rick embodies in its purest form. The Doofus Rick who gets bullied, the simple Rick who chose family, the cop Rick grinding through a thankless shift, the whole grim population of the Citadel, all of them are Ricks whose universes qualified for the club, which means all of them are, on paper, the brightest minds in their own realities. And yet they are miserable, exploited, disposable, ruled over by a council, and later played by a Morty. The curve promised them supremacy and handed them a caste system. That is the cruelty tucked inside the machine. It guaranteed that a Rick would always be on top, but it never promised that being a Rick would be enough. And for the overwhelming majority of them, being a Rick turns out to be a life sentence rather than a crown. So the curve gives us our framing, and it is a bleak one. The game was rigged before the first punch landed, rigged by the very man we are asking people to beat, and the rigging worked so well that for most of the series, the only real threats to Rick C-137 come from the two directions the curve could not fully guard. One is a Rick who somehow stands outside the filtering, a Rick who is not lesser, not a variation on the theme but a true equal, a Rick whose mind is an honest match rather than a curated echo. There is exactly one of those, and he is the reason this video has a subject at all. The other is someone who refuses to play the Rick game entirely and flips the board. We are going to spend the heart of tonight on the first of them, the one Rick built to the same specification as ours, the one who did not merely threaten to beat C-137 but did it, thoroughly, and got away with it for the better part of 2 decades. Before we can meet him, though, we have to finish the story of the pack he stood apart from, because to understand why one Rick mattered, you have to understand why all the others did not. So let us talk about the pack itself, the great collective of Ricks who decided that if no single one of them could stand against the worst of them, then perhaps all of them together might. That collective is the Trans-Dimensional Council of Ricks. Its home is the Citadel, and the whole arrangement is the multiverse's answer to a very simple problem. When you have thousands of the smartest beings in existence, and they are all more or less the same person, and that person is by nature paranoid, arrogant, and prone to violence, how do you keep them from murdering one another? The answer they reached was government. They built a council. They built a police force, a currency, a bureaucracy, a school system, an entire civilization run by Ricks and staffed by Mortys, all of it founded on the promise of mutual protection. And it is worth being clear about who founded it, because we touched on this already, and it is one of the calmer ironies buried in the story. The Citadel exists because a coalition of Ricks tried to kill our Rick, lost, and made peace on his terms. He helped build the place. Then, having helped build it, he refused a seat on its council and walked away in contempt, and for years afterward, he treated the entire institution as beneath him. That contempt was not misplaced, and Rick and Morty goes out of its way to prove it right. By most accounts, whenever the Citadel goes up directly against our Rick, things tend to end badly for the Citadel. That is the fundamental fact of their relationship. The collective was assembled to solve the problem of a Rick who could not be beaten one-on-one, and the collective could not beat him either. At the top of the structure sat a council of standout Ricks, and the names are worth hearing even if most of them never earn more than a moment on screen, because the names are part of the joke being told about identity. There is the spokesman, called Rick the Fourth, who does most of the talking whenever the council needs to address our Rick. There is one called Quantum Rick, and one called Maximum's Rickimus, and another called Zeta Alpha Rick, and one carrying the wonderfully absurd name Rick Timinus Sanchez Aminius, which sounds like what you would get if you fed the name Rick Sanchez through a Latin grammar textbook. And there is a council member listed as Rick Prime. Now I have to stop on that last one and hold up a hand, because this is a correction that matters more than almost anything else we will cover tonight, and it is a trap that has caught plenty of people who talk about this series, and I would rather we not fall into it. The Rick Prime who sat on the Council of Ricks is not the Rick Prime we are going to spend most of tonight on. They are two entirely different characters who happen to share a name. The council member called Rick Prime was one of the many Ricks our Rick killed when he tore through the Citadel's leadership. He is a footnote, a body, a name on a roster. The other Rick Prime, the one who murdered Diane, the one this whole video orbits, the villain the series is built around, is a separate being altogether, and he was never a member of the council. If you ever see someone claim that our Rick killed the arch-villain Rick Prime back in the 3rd season during the council massacre, that person has confused the two, and the confusion scrambles the timeline completely, because the real Rick Prime is not killed until years later in an entirely different storyline. Same name, different men. Keep them apart in your head, because Rick and Morty absolutely does not go out of its way to help you, and the shared name is, I suspect, a small trap the writers laid on purpose. A reminder that in a place of infinite Ricks, a name is worth almost nothing. The Council's collective failure against our Rick is the reason the Citadel matters to our question at all. Consider a group with, functionally, unlimited manpower, all of it genius level, all of it equipped with the same portal technology and the same scientific knowledge our Rick carries. If sheer numbers of Ricks could beat a Rick, the Council would have managed it. They held every advantage that scale can give you. It was not enough, twice over. It was not enough in the founding war, when the coalition that became the Citadel could not put him down and had to surrender. And it was not enough later, when he returned to their halls and cut through their leadership on his way to settling a wholly unrelated score with a galactic government. The Citadel is, from beginning to end, a monument to the idea that you cannot beat this man by being more Ricks. More Ricks only means more of the exact same limitations, multiplied. You can see the same lesson in the assassination squad we mentioned earlier, the Elite 5 Rick unit sent to end him, every one of whom he killed. Notice what that unit represents. It is not a mob. It is not the desperate coalition of the founding war. It is a curated team, the best killers the Ricks could assemble, presumably chosen for exactly the traits that would let them finish the job. And it failed the same way the mob failed, the same way the council failed. The trouble was never that the Ricks who came for him were unprepared or too few. The trouble is that they were Ricks, and being a Rick, inside a system designed to make Ricks the cleverest thing in every room, means being a variation on a man who was already the best variation. You cannot out-Rick the Rickest Rick. The math does not allow it. The curve does not allow it. What the Citadel can do, and what it is truly important for, is not beating our Rick, but revealing the shape of the world he lives in. The Council governs, which means the Council exploits. and the population it governs and exploits is made almost entirely of Ricks and Mortys, which produces the strangest social order in all of fiction. A caste system in which every member of every caste is, technically, the same two people. There are Ricks at the top, running the banks and the government. There are Ricks in the middle doing ordinary work, driving taxis, walking beats as police, standing at factory lines. There are Mortys everywhere at the bottom, because in this society a Morty is not so much a person as a resource, a required accessory, a source of the camouflage that lets a Rick move through the universe unnoticed. And all of it, every layer, sits inside the wall that guarantees a Rick is supreme. The Citadel is what supremacy actually looks like once you build a whole society out of it, and it looks like misery, because a civilization of the same arrogant, self-loathing man, endlessly recreated, is never going to be a happy place. That misery is the crack that eventually breaks the whole thing open, and it is the reason the real threat to Rick supremacy rises from the bottom of the Citadel rather than the top. But we will get there. For now, the takeaway is clean, and it is bleak. The collective of Ricks, in every form it took, the founding coalition, the standing council, the elite squad, tried to beat our Rick and could not, and the reason is baked into what they are. They are him, slightly worse. And you do not beat a man by fielding thousands of slightly worse copies of him, however clever each copy happens to be. Which is exactly why the one Rick who could beat him had to be something else. Not a slightly worse copy. Not a variation on the theme. A true equal who came from outside the theme entirely. From a version of the same life that made all the same discoveries and then made one different, colder choice. It is time to meet him. His name, the one the writers finally settled on, is Rick Prime, and arriving at that name took them a while. A small piece of trivia that matters more than it should. Early on, before he had a proper introduction, the production referred to him informally as Weird Rick. That was never a separate character. There was no Weird Rick living alongside Rick Prime. They are the same being, and Weird Rick was simply the placeholder before Dan Harmon and the writing staff landed on the name that stuck, which they talked about around the release of the episode that introduced him properly. So if you ever meet the phrase Weird Rick and wonder whether he is some other variant we have not covered, he is not. He is this man, under an older label. I flag it because in a story this crowded with near-identical characters, a stray nickname can spawn an entire imaginary person in the fandom's collective memory, and this one nearly did. Rick Prime comes from what Rick and Morty calls the Prime Dimension, and there is a detail about that place easy to skip past and worth slowing down for, because it tells you something about how the writers think of him. Our Rick has a designation. He is Rick C-137, and that string of letters and numbers is practically a second name for him by now. It marks his home reality. Rick Prime's dimension has none. It carries no designation at all. In a cosmology obsessed with cataloging and labeling every reality, the villain comes from the one that refuses to be cataloged, the Prime Dimension, the reality sitting outside the numbering scheme entirely. You can read that 100 ways, and I want to be honest that the reading is mine and not the writer's. But the one I keep returning to is that the missing number is the point. Our Rick is one entry in an infinite list. Rick Prime presents himself as the original, the one the copies are copied from, the reality that came first and needs no label, because everything else is a variation on it. Whether that is literally true in the fiction is left deliberately murky. What is not murky is that he believes it, and that belief is a large part of what makes him so dangerous. Because the research is firm about one thing above all the rest, the fact that justifies this video existing at all. Rick Prime is intellectually matched with our Rick. Not close. Not a worthy rival who nonetheless falls a step short. Matched. Rick and Morty and the material around it describe their conflict in exactly those terms. Neither one able to gain a true step on the other. Two minds of identical caliber circling each other across decades. Every other Rick we have discussed, and every one we still will tonight, is in some measurable way a lesser version of our Rick, a variation the curve permitted. Rick Prime is not a lesser version. He is the exception the curve could not filter out. A Rick who is not below the reference point, but level with it. And his equipment, the gadgets and the tech, The portal technology and everything downstream of it is not merely equal to our Rick's. It is described as more advanced. He has the same mind and better tools. If you are trying to answer the question of who could actually beat Rick C-137, this is the whole answer, and everything else on the list is an asterisk. There is one Rick who is built to the same specification, and this is him. But a matched intellect and better gear would only make him a formidable opponent. What makes him the villain, what makes him the wound the whole story is built around, is what he did with all of it. And to understand that, we have to go back to the beginning, to the day everything for our Rick went wrong, which Rick and Morty finally shows you in flashback years into its run. Picture a younger Rick Sanchez, the one who would become C-137, in his garage. He is not yet the monster we know. He has a wife, Diane, and a young daughter, the original Beth. And by every sign he is, for this version of the man, close to happy. He has done the science. He has cracked interdimensional travel, or he stands right on the verge of it. Into this scene comes another version of himself, Rick Prime, offering a partnership. Prime has solved portal travel too, and he arrives with a proposition, an invitation to leave all of this behind, the wife, the child, the small domestic life, and go out into the infinite together, two Ricks unshackled, to do whatever two beings like that would do with the whole multiverse thrown open. It is the offer to become exactly what our Rick eventually becomes anyway. And on that day, in that garage, our Rick says no. He looks at the multiverse, and he looks at his family, and he chooses his family. He is happy. He does not want it. That refusal is what kills them. Rick Prime does not take rejection as a matter of personal preference. He takes it as an insult, as proof of a smallness he despises, and his answer is not to shrug and leave. His answer is to reach through a portal and drop a bomb into that garage. The blast kills Diane. It kills the original Beth, the little girl, and the Rick who chose them is left broken and wounded on the floor. In a single moment, the version of himself he had turned down took away the entire reason he had turned him down. It is among the cruelest things one character does to another anywhere in the series, and it is cruel in a specific, targeted way. Rick Prime did not simply kill a Rick's family. He killed the family that a Rick had chosen over him, which means he killed them to prove a point about himself, to show that choosing love over power was a mistake, a weakness, a thing that gets punished. He murdered a woman and a child as an argument. I keep coming back to that moment because it reframes our Rick entirely. Everything he becomes, the drinking, the nihilism, the cruelty, the endless running, grows out of this. The man who says nothing matters was once a man who had decided something mattered so much he would trade infinity for it, and then that something was taken from him by a version of himself who thought him a fool for wanting it. His nihilism is not a philosophy he reasoned his way into. It is a scar. He learned that loving something makes it a target, and he learned it from himself, and he never got past it, because how could anyone? The bomb in the garage is the origin of everything, the wound underneath the jokes, and the being who said it is the only Rick who ever operated at our Rick's level. What our Rick does next is what makes him our Rick. He finishes the portal gun. He does not build it to explore. He builds it to hunt, and he sets out across the infinite multiverse to find the one specific version of himself who did this. A needle in a haystack the size of forever, and he gives decades to the search. This is the revenge that organizes his entire adult life, the quest beneath all the other quests. Every zany adventure, every dimension hopped and creature fought and planet ruined happens against the background of a man who is, on some level, always still looking for the Rick who bombed his garage. He kept his own home dimension frozen in a loop of that worst day for a long time, unable to release it, and eventually he moved in with an alternate version of Beth, an adult daughter from another reality entirely, and became the grandfather we follow. But the hunt never stopped. It only went quiet, waiting, for years, for the one Rick equal to him to surface again. And when Rick Prime finally does resurface, the story gets to ask the question this whole video is named after, and answer it in the plainest way it ever answers anything. Before we get to the hunt and how it ends, Let me spend real time on what Rick Prime actually is, both as a fighter and as a mind, because saying the two Ricks are matched is one thing, and seeing what that match is built from is another. I should be honest about my sources here, since this is exactly the sort of subject where the internet fills in numbers the series never gave. Certain corners of the fandom will quote you Rick Prime's strength level, his durability rating, as though they were printed on a trading card somewhere. They are not. Rick and Morty never assigns him statistics, so I will describe him qualitatively, the way the story actually presents him, and wherever I am leaning on the broader lore instead of a scene you can point to on screen, I will say so out loud. Start with the body, since the body marks the clearest difference between him and our Rick. Rick Prime is heavily augmented. Where our Rick is, physically, an aging human held together by stimulants and spite, Prime has rebuilt himself with cybernetics, and the result is a frame that runs well past human limits. Stronger than a man has any right to be. Faster. More durable, harder to put down through raw punishment alone. This is a real asymmetry, and an important one, because it means that even in the scenarios where our Rick could outthink an ordinary enemy and win on a clever gadget, Rick Prime deletes that easy road by simply absorbing the hit and continuing. You cannot outmaneuver him the way our Rick outmaneuvers nearly everyone, because he is not slower than you, and you cannot outlast him either, because his body knits itself back together. That healing is the second piece, and it is the one that makes him a nightmare to face. Rick Prime regenerates. The lore describes him closing severe wounds almost the instant they open, shrugging off damage that would finish an ordinary being, even growing back pieces of himself that have been taken. Consider what that does to the arithmetic of beating him. Our Rick's whole style, across every season, runs on ending threats efficiently. One decisive move, the fight over before the enemy grasped that it had begun. Against a thing that heals as fast as you can wound it, the decisive move stops existing. No single blow finishes the work, because the work keeps undoing itself. To beat an opponent like that, you do not have to be cleverer for one instant. You have to stay cleverer for longer than he can heal, which is an entirely different and far uglier problem, and it explains a great deal about why the hunt dragged on as long as it did. Then comes the piece I find most chilling, because it speaks to the matched intellect rather than the upgraded body. Rick Prime does not merely fight well, he plans across time, and he plans in a way built specifically to defeat being hunted by another Rick. From the start, he understood that the version of himself he had wronged would come for him, and that this pursuer would be precisely as clever as he was, carrying precisely the same tools. So he arranged his whole existence around never being where he appeared to be. He salts the multiverse with decoys. He plants counterfeit versions of himself, body doubles and clones, across countless timelines. He records holograms of himself ahead of time and posts them exactly where a hunter would expect the real man to stand, so that when our Rick finally corners Rick Prime, he keeps cornering a recording, a puppet, a projection, while the true Prime sits somewhere else entirely, having already gamed out the whole approach. Some of those decoys are not simple distractions. Some of them are weapons. Rick and Morty leans on this trick more than once, and the version that lands hardest is the trap wearing the shape of the man. Our Rick, or the hunters moving alongside him, reach for what they take to be Rick Prime and instead trip a mechanism he left waiting, a snare that does not kill them so much as bag them, sweep them up and lock them away, so that the act of finding him becomes the act of being caught by him. He weaponized his own scarcity. He made the search itself hazardous. That is not the conduct of a brute with a strong body. That is a mind operating as the true equal of the cleverest Rick anyone has ever met, running many moves ahead of a pursuer who is himself running many moves ahead, each of them reading the other, neither able to seize the decisive edge. The official line on their conflict, that neither man can get a genuine step in front of the other, is not marketing copy. It is the real texture of how the chase actually feels. There is one more ability that sets Rick Prime apart from nearly every other Rick, and it earns its own moment, because people underrate how rare it is in this universe. Rick Prime is among the very few Ricks to master time itself. Time travel here is treated as almost forbidden ground, a technology so unstable and dangerous that even Ricks mostly refuse to touch it. Our Rick has a famous, sneering relationship with the whole idea, and yet Prime is described as one of only a handful of Ricks who actually cracked it, who work with time rather than merely with space. If you want a single fact that lifts him clear of the entire rest of the roster, this is the one. Thousands upon thousands of Ricks mastered travel between dimensions. A vanishing few mastered travel through time. He is one of them. That by itself drops him into a category with almost no other members, and it means his planning stretches not only across space and across timelines, but potentially across when, a depth of anticipation that edges toward the unbeatable. Now let me be honest about where Rick and Morty draws its own line, because I have no interest in inflating him into a god. Rick Prime is not omnipotent, and the writers are careful to keep him human enough to be killable, since a villain who can never lose is not a villain at all, only a wall. His augmentations are vast, but they are not infinite. His planning is brilliant, but it is not literally precognitive, or the story could never end. And, crucially, and we will reach exactly how, he does lose in the end, which by definition means he was always beatable. Yet look at the price. Hold that price in mind because it is the whole moral of this stretch. It took our Rick, the being the entire multiverse is filtered to keep supreme. It took decades of obsessive hunting. It took an alliance with the one Morty sharp enough to break the Central Finite Curve. And it took Rick Prime being physically pinned by that Morty before the killing blow could land. That is what beating the single Rick truly matched with ours actually cost. It ate the better part of our Rick's life, and it demanded help from outside the whole Rick system to finish. Which pulls the question of this video into hard focus, and let me state it plainly before we go on, because it is the honest center of the whole thing. When people ask which Ricks could actually beat C-137, they usually picture a lineup, a bracket, a tournament of variants where you weigh Pickle Rick against Tiny Rick against Doofus Rick and watch who advances. That framing is a fantasy. A fun one, and we will indulge parts of it later tonight, because the variants really are fascinating. But the true answer, the canonical answer, is a roster of one. There is exactly one Rick ever presented as a real match for ours. One Rick with the mind to equal him, the tech to exceed him, and the will to have already beaten him once, decisively, on the worst day of his life. Everyone else is a curiosity. Rick Prime is the answer, and the deadliest single object he ever built, the thing that makes his win over our Rick permanent and unforgivable and impossible to reverse, is a weapon we have to cover next, because it is the reason no happy ending waits anywhere in the infinite multiverse for the man we follow, and it is the widely misread piece of canon in the entire series. The weapon is called the Omega device, and it is why, in a series built entirely on the premise that anything can be undone by hopping to another reality, one specific loss can never be undone at all. To see why it matters this much, you first have to understand the escape hatch it slams shut, because that escape hatch is the emotional logic the whole series runs on, and the Omega device is the one thing that welds it closed for good. Picture that escape hatch. In an infinite multiverse, nothing is ever really lost, because somewhere out there sits a version of it that survived. Break something, and there is a reality where it never broke. Lose someone, and there is a reality where they are still breathing. This is the soft cruelty and the soft comfort at the center of Rick and Morty, and our Rick reaches for it constantly, sometimes as a punchline and sometimes as a way to keep functioning. When his own world turns unlivable, he steps into a fresh one. When a version of a person dies, another version goes on existing. Grief in this cosmology is meant to be optional, because loss is meant to be local. That is the rule. The Omega device breaks that rule, and it breaks it deliberately, and it breaks it aimed straight at the one loss our Rick could never stop grieving. The device works like this, and I will be as exact as I can, because this is the fact viewers have caught this channel getting wrong before, and I will not repeat the mistake. The device does not kill a person in a single reality. It erases its target, along with every last one of that target's variants, across every dimension in the entire multiverse, all at once, and then it rewrites everyone's memory so that the target was never there to begin with. It does not leave one Diane dead. It makes every Diane into someone who never existed. Every version, in every reality, inside the curve and beyond it, gone, and the memory of her scrubbed clean from every mind that once held it. And Rick Prime aimed it at Diane. Weigh what that actually means for our Rick, because it is the darkest single fact in the series, and nearly everyone underrates it. The comfort the whole multiverse is supposed to hand him, the promise that somewhere she is still alive, is a lie in her particular case. And it is a lie because Rick Prime engineered it that way. There is no reality our Rick can travel to where Diane survived the bomb, because there is no reality where Diane exists at all anymore. He cannot portal into a kinder timeline and find her waiting. He cannot cheat this loss the way he cheats every other one. The single escape hatch that defines his entire existence has been nailed shut, and the man who nailed it is the same man who killed her to begin with. Rick Prime did not only take our Rick's family, he took the possibility of ever recovering any version of them, anywhere, ever again. That is why I keep hammering this. If you ever hear someone say that Rick could just slip off to a world where his wife is still alive, that is not a small mistake. It is the exact inverse of the biggest thing the villain ever pulled off. The Omega device exists precisely to make that sentence false. There is one faint exception, and it is worth naming exactly because it is so small, since the smallness is the whole point. A residual trace of Diane lingers, not as a living person, but as an image, a fragment, the sort of thing the erasure could not quite reach. You get a glimpse of her inside a memory, a hushed scene of target practice with revolvers in a dusty, southwestern kind of setting, an echo clinging to the very edges of what was wiped away. But that is the ghost of a memory, not a person you can track down and hold. It is the difference between a photograph that survived a fire and the person standing in the photograph. The picture proves she was real. It does not bring her back. If anything, the fact that the erasure fell a hair short of perfect, that this lone flicker of her endures, makes the whole thing sadder still, because it leaves our Rick with just enough of her to know exactly what was stolen and no route whatsoever to reach it. And this is where it turns almost unbearably human, and where I want to draw a clean line between what happens and what it means. After the hunt ends, after Rick Prime is dead and the Omega device has finished its permanent work, our Rick is left with a Diane-shaped hole that the entire multiverse cannot fill. So he does the thing a grieving genius would do. He builds one. He assembles an artificial version of Diane, a simulation, an AI, a robot facsimile of the wife erased from all of existence, and he keeps her near, and he talks to her. Now, Rick and Morty presents this with very little comment, and I think that restraint is deliberate, so let me match it. What happens is that our Rick makes a copy. The interpretation, the reading, and I flag it plainly as a reading, is that nothing the character ever does looks more defeated than this. This is the man who conquered the multiverse, who beat back every Rick who came for him, who outplanned a galactic government from inside a chair, reduced to programming a machine to impersonate the woman he loved, because the real one and every echo of the real one has been surgically cut out of reality by his oldest enemy. It is not a reunion. It is a man building a mannequin so he does not have to be alone with the silence. And so no one mistakes it. That robot is not Diane coming back. It is a monument to the fact that she cannot. The Omega device saw to that. This is also, I think, the deepest reason Rick Prime earns the title of the villain who actually beat C-137, more than any punch or any gadget could explain. Beating someone is not only about the fight. Yes, Prime outfought our Rick on the day of the bomb, but the Omega device means he also won the war after his own death. He arranged matters so that even killing him would not hand our Rick what he wanted, because what our Rick wanted was his family back, and the family had already been deleted from the fabric of everything before the final confrontation ever began. When our Rick finally beats Rick Prime with his bare hands, the victory is hollow by design, and it is hollow because of this device. Rick Prime engineered a way to lose the last battle and still win the underlying war, and that is a cruelty no other Rick in the series comes near. The rest of them wanted to kill our Rick. Rick Prime wanted to prove to our Rick that his love had been a mistake, and then he made that proof mathematically permanent across an infinite multiverse. He alone grasped that the way to truly defeat this particular man was not to end his life, but to guarantee his grief. And then he did exactly that, thoroughly and forever. So when we turn to the hunt now and to how it finally ended, keep the Omega device sitting in the back of your mind the entire time, because it changes the flavor of the victory completely. This is not a story where the hero corners the villain and wins his life back. It is a story where the hero spends decades chasing the one man who was his equal, at last catches him, at last kills him, and learns at the end that the thing he was truly chasing had been out of reach the whole way through, sealed off by the very act of violence that started the chase. The hunt is real, and it is thrilling, and it stands among the finest arcs Rick and Morty ever built. But it was never going to end in peace. The Omega device made certain of that before the hunt had even begun. For most of the series, the hunt for Rick Prime lives as a rumor. It sits in the background, in flashbacks and half-references, a wound the story keeps its hand pressed over without ever fully showing you. You know our Rick lost his family. You know he built the portal gun to find the one responsible. But for whole seasons, the man he is looking for stays off-screen, a name spoken rarely, an absence the entire character is shaped around. Then, in the opening episode of the 6th season, Rick and Morty finally lets him back into the story, and the way it does that is characteristically cruel, because our Rick does not track Rick Prime down. Our Rick accidentally sets him loose. The episode carries the title Solarix, and it opens in the wreckage of the previous season's chaos, with our Rick and Morty stranded and forced to lean on a piece of default technology, a kind of reset function that sends travelers back toward their true dimensions of origin. It is meant to be a way home. But the multiverse does not sort itself neatly, and when that reset fires, it does not only push our Rick and our Morty back toward their beginnings. It reaches through the tangled web of who belongs where, and it brushes against Rick Prime, and the effect is to spring him loose from wherever he had been hiding and set him moving again. Our Rick spends decades unable to find the man. Then, in a single unlucky use of a homing device, he frees him without meaning to. The hunter's own tools hand the prey a head start. It is exactly the bleak irony this series loves, the sense that the universe is not so much malicious as indifferent, and that indifference keeps costing our Rick the one thing he actually wants. What Solarix does, past the mechanics, is confirm that Rick Prime is real, present, still operating, and that he still regards our Rick with the same contempt he carried in the garage all those years ago. There is a coldness to how he gets reintroduced. He is not raging, he is not obsessed. That asymmetry is what makes him so hard to bear. For our Rick, this is the defining trauma of his whole existence, the thing he reorganized his life around. For Rick Prime, our Rick is a loose end, an old piece of business, a discarded version of himself he wronged once and barely thinks about. The imbalance of feeling becomes its own kind of wound. Our Rick has spent a lifetime chasing a man who treats him as an afterthought. If you have ever wanted something from someone who simply did not care about you the way you cared about them, the return of Rick Prime lands in a very specific and uncomfortable place, and I think Rick and Morty knows exactly what it is doing when it plays the villain that cool. From there, the 6th season threads the hunt through its other stories, kept low, until it comes roaring back for the finale, and the finale is where you finally see the chase as a chase. Our Rick reveals, in a way he had been hiding even from his own family, that the search never stopped, that under all the ordinary adventures he has been tracking Rick Prime the entire time, refining his methods, closing the distance. He has a war room. He has been at this obsessively, privately, for as long as we have known him, and the finale pulls the curtain back on how much of himself he has poured into it. When the two of them finally make contact, the promise about their being matched pays off, because our Rick does not simply find Rick Prime and win. He finds a version of him. He reaches the end of the trail, and what waits for him there is one of Rick Prime's decoys, a body double, a plant, the trap we talked about earlier made flesh. This is the moment the abstract idea of the decoys turns visceral, and it rewards slowing down, because it is where you feel the matched intellect most sharply. Our Rick is as sharp as anything the multiverse has ever produced. He has spent decades preparing for this exact confrontation. He has worked through every angle. And Rick Prime worked through the fact that our Rick would work through every angle, and he seeded the endpoint of the hunt with a fake, so that the finest mind in all of reality arrives at the culmination of his life's obsession and grabs a puppet. The real Rick Prime is elsewhere, having predicted the whole approach. Neither man can get a single step ahead of the other, and here you see why. Because each of them is running the same simulation of the other's mind, and the simulations are equally good. It is like watching two grandmasters who happen to also be each other, and the game will not resolve on cleverness alone, because their cleverness cancels out. Something else has to break the deadlock. And when that something arrives, it is not more intelligence. It is an alliance our Rick would never have made if he were not desperate, a willingness to be helped that he almost never shows, and the intervention of a mind that is not a Rick's at all. I will stop and name something about this stretch, because it is a real opinion and not just a recap. The 6th season's handling of the Rick Prime arc is, to me, the moment the series fully commits to taking its own mythology seriously, and that is a risk. For years, Rick and Morty protected itself with irony. It would build up a piece of lore and then puncture it with a joke, refuse to let anything matter too much, keep the emotional stakes at arm's length so it could always retreat into comedy. The hunt for Rick Prime is where it stops flinching. It lets the wound be a real wound. It lets the villain turn genuinely menacing rather than a punchline. And the payoff for that commitment is that when the confrontation finally lands in the following season, it hits with a weight the series had never quite allowed itself before. This is the thing that stays with me about the whole arc, honestly. A story that spent so long insisting nothing matters finally admitted that one thing did. And the one thing was a man grieving a family erased from existence, chasing the self who erased them. That is not a comedy premise. That is a tragedy the comedy had been hiding the entire time. By the close of the 6th season, then, the pieces all sit on the board. Rick Prime is loose, matched, cybernetically enhanced, self-healing, guarded by decoys and holograms, and holding the only weapon that ever truly beat our Rick, the device that erased Diane from everything. Our Rick is nearer than he has ever been, and still unable to land the blow, because his equal keeps slipping the noose. And waiting in the wings is the one figure clever enough to change the equation, a Morty who had already broken the wall that kept Rick supreme, who had his own reasons to want Rick Prime and the Omega device, and who was willing to help our Rick corner the one man he could never corner alone. What happens when those forces converge is the whole hinge of this subject. The episode where the question of the video gets its clearest possible answer, and it is where we go next. The episode carries the title Unmortrican. It arrives in the 7th season, and it comes the closest Rick and Morty ever comes to giving a straight answer to the question this whole video is built on. If you want to know which Rick could actually beat Rick, C-137, this episode holds up the only one who did, and then it shows you, in detail, exactly what it took to finally beat him back. It rewards a slow walkthrough, because almost every important truth about the subject lives inside how this confrontation plays out. It begins with the Alliance, and the Alliance is the first sign that our Rick has accepted something he spent the whole series refusing, which is that he cannot do this alone. He teams up with Evil Morty. We will get into who Evil Morty is properly a little later, but for now the important thing is that he is a Morty, not a Rick. That he is arguably as dangerous a mind as the series ever produced, and that he carries his own cold, practical reasons for wanting Rick Prime found and the Omega device secured. Two hunters, then, our Rick and this Morty, closing in together on the one Rick neither of them could reach alone. And the plain fact that our Rick needs a partner at all, that a man this brilliant required the help of a runaway Morty to corner his equal, tells you how high Rick Prime sits. You do not need backup to beat someone beneath you. You need backup to beat someone level with you. They follow the trail, and the trail, as it always does with Rick Prime, turns out to be a trap. What they reach is not the man but another of his decoys, and this one is rigged. Through a mechanism of black portal fluid, it drops them into a prison, and the prison stands as one of the quietly devastating images in the entire series, because of who is already inside it. The cells are full of Ricks. Not random Ricks, Every one of them is a Rick who also tried to hunt Rick Prime, who also came for him seeking revenge or justice, or simply the kill, and who also failed and got swept into this collection. It is a museum of defeat. It is a room full of the exact thing this video is nominally cataloging. Ricks who wanted to beat the one Rick who beats Ricks, and every single one of them ended up here, caged, waiting, proof that trying was not enough. Our Rick, the Rickest Rick, walks into a jail already populated by his own kind, who attempted precisely what he is attempting, and it is the story telling you, in one image, that being a Rick who wants Rick Prime dead is a very common condition with a very consistent outcome. And then Rick Prime, characteristically, does not even show up in person to gloat. He addresses the prison by video, a recording, a taunt beamed into a room full of his failed hunters, and he offers them a game, a battle royale. The imprisoned Ricks are to fight one another, all of them, to the death. And the prize dangled in front of them is the thing every one of them wants past all reason. The thing that got them into this cage in the first place. He tells them the winner gets their Diane back. Every Rick in that room lost a Diane. Every one of them would tear the others apart for a chance at her. That cruel dangling promise is the purest distillation of who Rick Prime is. Because the prize is a lie, and a uniquely horrifying one. What he offers cannot be given. Diane is gone from every reality. He made certain of it himself. So the reward at the end of his battle royale, once it is revealed, is not a woman. It is a bomb. A bomb wearing Diane's face. He built an explosive in the likeness of the woman he erased, and offered it as a prize to a room full of men who would die for the real thing. And that is the joke he is telling. That their love is a weakness he can weaponize. That the very shape of their grief can be turned into the instrument of their death. Our Rick and Evil Morty destroy the thing and get themselves out, but the image stays with you. He turned Diane into a bomb. He had already turned her into an absence. Now he turned her memory into a trap. There is no bottom to this man's cruelty, and every layer of it aims at the same wound. When the two of them finally reach the real Rick Prime, the deadlock we talked about still holds. Two matched minds, neither able to pull ahead of the other, and so the thing that breaks it is not our Rick outthinking his equal. It is Evil Morty doing something a Rick would never think to do, because it requires being a Morty. Evil Morty swaps clothes with our Morty, and presents himself to Rick Prime as Prime's own original grandson, the Morty from the Prime dimension, staging a reunion, playing on the one relationship even this villain might carry a blind spot about. It is a con built entirely out of being underestimated, which is the Morty's whole power, and it works long enough to get close, to restrain Rick Prime, to pin the unpinnable man, and, crucially, to scan his mind and pull the data on the Omega device out of it. That is the move that ends the deadlock. Not force, not raw intellect. A disguise, a lie, and the willingness of a Morty to be seen as harmless right up until the instant he is not. And only then, with Rick Prime restrained, does our Rick get to do the thing he built his whole life around. He kills Rick Prime with his bare hands. No gadget, no clever device. He beats him to death, physically, with his own two hands, and Rick and Morty makes you watch it, because after everything, the tools would have been an insult. This had to be personal, and Rick Prime, right to the end, refuses him the satisfaction of fear or regret. He mocks him through all of it. He tells our Rick that he has become him, that the man beating him to death in a rage is no different from the man who dropped the bomb, that the grief and the vengeance have shaped our Rick into exactly the thing he hated. The terrible part, the part the episode refuses to resolve cleanly, is that Rick Prime is not entirely wrong. The victory is soaked in that accusation. Our Rick gets his kill, the kill he waited a lifetime for, and he gets it while being told, correctly, that getting it has cost him whatever separated him from the monster. I need to be very precise about how this goes, because it is the crucial nuance in the entire subject, and it is one the fandom regularly flattens. Our Rick does not beat Rick Prime alone. He does not outduel him in a fair fight and stand triumphant over his equal through sheer superiority. That is not what happens, and dramatizing it that way gets the whole thing backward. He beats him with his bare hands only because Evil Morty had already restrained him, only because a Morty had run a con that a Rick could not have run, only after decades of hunting that failed again and again, only with an alliance he would never have made if he had any other option. The barehanded kill is real, but it is the last blow in a fight our Rick could not have won on his own merits. Take evil Morty out of the equation, and Rick Prime walks away. That is how matched they were. The brightest Rick in all of reality needed the brightest Morty in all of reality to hold his enemy still, and even then, the win tasted like ash. The aftermath is the part that turns a triumph into a tragedy. When it is over, evil Morty walks away with the Omega device, or the data to build it, the most dangerous weapon the series ever conceived, the thing that can erase anyone and all their variants from all of reality. Our Rick's revenge did not secure that weapon or destroy it. It handed it to a Morty. The entire decades-long quest, the thing that organized his whole life, ends with our Rick standing over a corpse, purpose gone, the woman he did it all for still erased from every reality by that very corpse, and the ultimate weapon now in the hands of the one being clever enough to be more dangerous than any Rick. He won the fight and lost nearly everything the fight was supposed to be about. His purpose evaporates. The hunt that gave his misery a shape is finished, and what remains underneath is just the misery, without even the dignity of a goal. So the answer to the video, delivered as plainly as this series ever delivers anything. Rick Prime is the Rick who could actually beat C-137, and the proof is that he did, on the day of the bomb and forever after through the Omega device. And C-137 could only beat him back with the help of a Morty who had broken the entire Rick system, and even that victory left the real prize out of reach, and the ultimate weapon in worse hands than before. If you were hoping the answer to who beats our Rick would be uplifting, this is not that kind of story. The one who could beat him did, and beating him back did not fix a single thing. Now we come to a Rick who, on first glance, seems to belong at the very top of any list of Ricks who beat C-137, because he pulled off something none of the others could. He captured our Rick. He caught him, pinned him down, and tortured him, and for a stretch of that opening season it really does look as though we are watching a Rick who outmatched the hero of the story. The fandom calls him Evil Rick, in shorthand, and his story is the great early lesson in why you have to look closely at any of this. Almost nothing about him is what it appears to be. Getting him wrong is one of the classic mistakes people make with Rick and Morty. He shows up in a first-season episode called Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, the one that first cracks open the whole idea of a multiverse teeming with Ricks and Mortys. It is where we first glimpse the Citadel. It is where we learn that our Rick is one of an enormous population of himself. Into that reveal walks a villain who hunts and murders Ricks and Mortys across dimensions, who keeps a hidden lair stuffed with tortured captives, and who does the one thing that should be impossible. He takes our Rick alive, he straps him down, helpless, at his mercy. For a series that had spent its whole first season insisting our Rick is the most capable being in any room, that lands as a real shock. Someone finally has him. Someone finally won. Except Evil Rick did not win anything, because Evil Rick was never the one in charge. This is the twist that reframes the entire episode and, honestly, a good stretch of the series that follows. The menacing figure doing all the capturing and the torturing is not calling the shots at all. He is a puppet. His body has been cybernetically lobotomized, hollowed out, converted into a remote-controlled shell, a meat receiver piloted from somewhere else. The true intelligence behind everything, the mind arranging the murders and the traps and the capture of our Rick, sits hidden, and it hides in the last place anyone in this world would think to check. It is the Morty standing at Evil Rick's side, the meek, unassuming sidekick, the one with the eye patch. The transmitter steering that lobotomized Rick body is tucked inside the eye patch. The villain of the episode was never the Rick, it was the Morty. The Rick was only the weapon the Morty had aimed. Let me slow down here, because there are two specific errors people make about this figure, and both of them scramble the lore. The first is to assume the lobotomized Rick puppet is our Rick, C-137. He is not. Nothing in the episode identifies the eye patch-controlled cyborg Rick as C-137, and treating him as our protagonist under mind control muddles the whole picture. He is a separate Rick, a captured body, One more victim wearing a familiar face, and his only job is to be the hardware. The second error is subtler, and it involves the Morty. It is tempting to say this Morty was once the sidekick of our Rick, that he is somehow C-137's own Morty turned bad, but the episode does not back that tidy a story either. The safe, canonical thing to say is that this Morty had an original Rick, a Rick he was once paired with, and that Rick is not established as our protagonist. So resist the neat version where evil Morty is the dark mirror of our Rick and our Morty specifically. Rick and Morty keeps this deliberately vaguer than that, and the vagueness carries weight. What matters for us is the shape of the trick, because it is the same trick that eventually breaks the entire Rick system. The deadliest presence in that first season story is not a Rick at all. It is a Morty who grasped something no Rick ever truly accepted. In a universe organized entirely around the supremacy and the paranoia of Ricks, the safest place to hide a genius is inside a Morty, because no Rick will ever suspect one. Ricks look at Mortys and see camouflage, accessories, throwaway grandsons whose main purpose is to smear a Rick's brainwaves and make him harder to trace. That contempt is a blind spot the size of a planet. This Morty spotted it and moved in. He made a weapon out of being underestimated. He took the entire condescension of Rick culture and turned it into a hiding place. And from inside that hiding place, he ran a lobotomized Rick like a drone and very nearly disposed of our Rick before our Rick even worked out who the enemy was. That Morty is, naturally, the one the fandom calls Evil Morty, and he becomes the closest thing the series has to a true overarching threat, right alongside Rick Prime, which is why he keeps crossing paths with our question, even though he is emphatically not a Rick. I will say that part loudly, because it matters for a video built around Ricks. Evil Morty is a Morty. If you are keeping a list of Ricks who could beat C-137, he does not go on it, since he is not one. But if you are honestly asking who in the multiverse can actually take our Rick down, you cannot leave him out, because he is arguably the only mind besides Rick Prime who works at that altitude, and unlike Rick Prime, he is still out there somewhere. He is the answer to a slightly different question, the question of who could beat C-137 without being a Rick, and that answer turns out to be a child our Rick's entire civilization trained itself to ignore. His climb across the series is a slow, patient thing, and it mirrors everything the Citadel claimed to stand for, turned inside out. He works his way up through Rick and Morty society from the very bottom, from the lowest caste there is, and he does it by exploiting the exact machinery the Ricks built to keep Mortys down. He runs a campaign. He climbs. He gathers power inside a system engineered to make sure a Morty could never hold any, and every rung is one more proof that the system's founding assumption that a Morty poses no threat was catastrophically wrong. Then, in the 5th season finale, he does the thing that rewrites the cosmology of the whole series. He exposes the Central Finite Curve, the great wall that keeps Rick supreme, hauls it into the light, and punches a hole through it. He steps out through that hole into the true, unfiltered multiverse, the honest infinity where Ricks are not promised to be the cleverest things alive, and he leaves the wall broken behind him. Consider what that act means inside our whole discussion. The Central Finite Curve was the machine that guaranteed no ordinary Rick could ever really be beaten, because it filtered reality down to the universes where Ricks win. Evil Morty broke the machine. He did not do it by being a stronger Rick, because he is no Rick at all. He did it by refusing to play the game the Ricks had built, by seeing the board itself instead of the pieces on it, and by walking off the board entirely. In doing so, he arguably did more damage to Rick supremacy than any Rick who ever came at C-137 with a portal gun and a grudge. He did not beat one Rick. He beat the thing that made Ricks unbeatable. The founding coalition could not manage that. The council could not manage it. The 5-man assassination squad could not manage it. A Morty from the gutter did, patiently, by staying underestimated for exactly as long as he needed to be. So where does that leave evil Rick, the puppet, the figure we open this chapter with? It leaves him as the perfect illustration of the whole trap, the reason you cannot take any of this at face value. The Rick who seemed to have beaten our Rick had beaten no one because he was not really there, because the mind behind him was a Morty, because the entire spectacle of a triumphant evil Rick was a costume thrown over a completely different sort of threat. If there is one lesson to carry out of this chapter and into the rest of the night, let it be this. When you go hunting for the Ricks who could beat C-137, do not simply tally the ones who look strong. Some of the ones who look strongest are hollow, remote-controlled shells, and the real danger is standing right beside them in a yellow shirt, wearing an expression of practiced harmlessness. The deadliest thing in a room full of Ricks was never another Rick. It was the one being everybody had trained themselves not to see. If evil Morty is what happens when the bottom of Rick society learns to think, then the rest of that bottom, the vast mass of Ricks who never rise and never escape, deserves a chapter of its own, because it is where Rick and Morty does its most honest work about what being a Rick actually costs. The third season hands us a full episode devoted to the interior life of the Citadel, and it is one of the finest things the series ever made, and not one of the Ricks in it could beat C-137 in a fight. That is precisely why they matter. They are the negative space around him. They show you what a Rick becomes when he is not the Rickest Rick, when the curve sets him at the top of nothing grander than a taxi route or a factory floor. The episode follows a handful of Ricks and Mortys through an ordinary, grinding day in the rebuilt Citadel, and its structure is deliberately unglamorous. There is a Rick who works as a beat cop, patrolling with a Morty partner, and he is the one who walks you through the class resentment simmering under the whole society, the way the Ricks at the bottom hate the Ricks at the top, the way a Rick with a badge is still just another disposable body to the Ricks who run things. There is a candidate Morty running for office, the thread that ties into evil Morty's larger rise. There are factory workers and students and ordinary citizens, all of them Ricks and Mortys, all of them living lives that are small and hard and unfair, inside a city supposedly built to make them the strongest beings in existence. The curve promised every one of them supremacy. What it handed them was a job, a landlord, and a boss who happens, somehow, to be themselves. At the center of that episode sits an idea so quietly devastating it may be the darkest thing Rick and Morty ever said about what a Rick is, and it arrives in the form of a product. There is a snack manufactured in the Citadel, a wafer, and it is beloved, and it runs on a secret. The secret is a Rick. Specifically, it is a Rick who, at some fork in his life, made the choice our Rick refused to make. This Rick chose family over science. He chose the small, warm, ordinary life. He walked away from the infinite. The series calls him Simple Rick, and it means the word with tenderness and with horror at once. Because the Citadel found him, and the Citadel imprisoned him, and it wired him into a machine that keeps him trapped forever inside the single happiest memory of his life, a memory of his daughter as a little girl on an ordinary morning. And the reason it holds him there, reliving that one perfect moment on an endless loop, is chemical. When a Rick is that happy, his brain produces a particular neurochemical, and that neurochemical is what flavors the wafers. The whole product, the whole beloved snack, runs on the harvested contentment of a man who chose love, strapped into a device that rings his one good memory for its emotional residue and sells it. I have to stop on that because it is the darkest joke in a series full of dark jokes, and it is aimed with terrible accuracy at our Rick in particular. Remember what our Rick's whole tragedy is. He chose family. He said no to Rick Prime, no to the infinite, yes to Diane and Beth, and it got them killed. Simple Rick is the version of that same choice that did not get punished with a bomb. The Rick who got to keep his family and his ordinary life. And look what the Citadel does to him. It cages him. It boils his happiness down to an ingredient. The Society of Ricks, the civilization founded on the premise that a Rick should be supreme, takes the one Rick who found real peace and turns his peace into a consumer good. The message here is brutal and clear. In the world the Ricks built, choosing family does not set you free. It makes you fuel. Whether the bomb takes your family, as it did with ours, or the factory takes your joy, as it did with Simple Rick, the outcome is the same. The system will not permit a Rick to simply be happy. It converts happiness into something it can use. The Rick who owns that factory, by the way, is worth a name, because he is a different kind of dangerous. He is a business magnate, a Rick who sits on a shadow council running the Citadel's economy from behind the elected government, and he gets a designation, Rick D. Sanchez III. He is no fighter. He would not last a moment against our Rick in any physical sense. But he stands for an axis of power most of these variants never touch. The axis of ownership, of capital, of the quiet control that comes from running the machinery everyone else leans on. If you were assembling a truly complete list of the ways a Rick might come out on top, you could not skip the Rick who worked out that in a city full of geniuses too proud to cooperate, the real power lay not in being the cleverest, but in owning the factory the clever ones eat from. He beats other Ricks not by outthinking them in a lab, but by owning the thing they need. It is a very human sort of victory, and a very bleak one, and it is completely useless against a Rick like ours, who needs nothing and answers to no one, which is exactly why our Rick could stroll through that entire society and treat all of it, the cops and the magnates and the councils alike, as beneath his notice. That is the through line of the whole Citadel underclass, and it is why none of them, from the beat cop to the wafer tycoon, is a real answer to the title. They are all variations on defeat. Each one shows you a Rick who took a different road and wound up trapped in a different cage, and the cages are the whole point. The cop is caged by his badge and his resentment. Simple Rick is caged by his own best memory. The magnate is caged by the empire he has to keep running. The candidate Morty is caged by a system he believes he is climbing and is really being used by. All of them are, technically, inside the curve, which means all of them are technically the smartest beings in their home realities, and all of them are miserable and small and stuck. The curve guaranteed them the crown and handed them a life sentence. And the third season Citadel episode is the series laying that contradiction out in full, without a single joke to soften the landing at the end. The thought I keep circling back to, whenever I turn these Ricks over in my head, is the honest take underneath all the recap. The reason our Rick is the Rickest Rick is not only that he is the sharpest or the cruelest of them, it is that he is the one who refused every cage. He would not sit on the council. He would not take a role in the society. He would not let himself be owned, employed, elected, or harvested. The other Ricks tried to build a life inside the structure, and the structure ate them. Our Rick looked at that same structure, correctly named it a trap, and stayed outside it, alone, on the run, unhappy but free. That is the difference between him and every Rick in that grim city. Not raw intelligence, because they all share that. Freedom. He is the only Rick who refused to be caught by anything except his own grief. And his grief, as we have seen, was the one cage even he could not break, because the man who built it made sure of that, with a device that erased the key from every reality at once. The Citadel could not cage our Rick. Only Rick Prime could, and he did it not with walls but with an absence. Now we drift into a strange subcategory of the roster, the Ricks who are not really other Ricks at all, but pieces of our own, split off, spun out, or copied straight from him. Each of them raises the same quiet puzzle, whether a part of C-137 could ever beat the whole of him. It is an interesting question, because if anyone has the raw material to match our Rick, surely it is a version made directly out of him. Rick and Morty runs that experiment more than once. The first version worth looking at is the one the series calls Toxic Rick, and he arrives, of all places, in a third season episode about self-improvement. The premise is that our Rick and Morty visit an alien spa offering a detoxification process, a machine that promises to remove your toxins, to strip away the poisonous parts of a person and leave a healthier version behind. Our Rick, being who he is, games the machine, because he does not trust anything that swears it can make him better. When the process runs, it does exactly what it advertises. Only the episode takes the metaphor literally, in the way this series always does. It does not just remove toxins in the medical sense. It physically separates our Rick into two beings. One is the detoxified Rick, cleaned of everything the machine judged to be poison. The other is everything the machine pulled out, condensed and handed its own body. A walking concentration of every toxic trait our Rick carries around. That second being is Toxic Rick, and he is no metaphor standing politely beside the real man. He is a real, embodied, separate creature, made entirely out of the worst of C-137. The reason he matters to our question is also the reason he is so unsettling. Toxic Rick is not weaker than the detoxified version. In some ways, he is sharper, more driven, more willing, because everything that ever held our Rick back, everything soft or hesitant or riddled with self-doubt, got sorted into the other body. Toxic Rick is our Rick's ambition and cruelty and brilliance, with none of the counterweight. He is what you would get if you took the deadliest man in the multiverse and cut away the small, buried parts of him that ever pull a punch. The episode even lets him make a play for real power, an attempt to spread the detoxification process in reverse, to make the whole world as toxic as he is, and for a stretch he reads as a credible threat. He is, briefly, a version of our Rick trying to remake reality in his own image, working with the full toolkit, because the toolkit was never in the toxins or the virtues. It was in the mind, and the mind copied over cleanly. This is exactly where the whole idea of a facet beating the whole falls apart. And it falls apart for a reason worth saying plainly, because it applies to every one of these split-off Ricks. Toxic Rick cannot beat C-137 in the end, because Toxic Rick is not a complete person, and the incompleteness is fatal. He is one half of a man. He has the ambition but not the restraint, the cruelty but not the cunning that only comes from knowing your own weaknesses intimately. The detoxified Rick, for his part, is broken in the opposite direction. The resolution of the episode is that neither half is viable alone, that a Rick made only of poison and a Rick made only of virtue are both cripples, both less than the whole, and that the real C-137 is the unstable, miserable, functional welding of the two. Toxic Rick gets reabsorbed. He goes back into the man he was pulled out of, because a part of C-137 simply cannot stand as an equal to C-137. The whole is not the sum of the parts. The whole is the friction between them, the endless war inside one's skull between the ambition and the restraint, and that friction is a large part of what makes our Rick, our Rick. So, the reading I want to offer, and I do mean it as a reading, is that Toxic Rick is the series answering a question a lot of fans quietly carry about the character, which is whether Rick would be more powerful if he just stopped fighting himself, if he leaned all the way into the ruthlessness and dropped the self-loathing and the hesitation and the buried decency. Toxic Rick is that experiment made flesh. The answer the episode gives is no. A Rick who is only the ruthlessness is not more dangerous. He is less, because ruthlessness without self-awareness is just a tantrum with a laser gun. Our Rick is lethal precisely because he hates himself, because the restraint and the cruelty grind against each other constantly, because he second-guesses and despises and understands himself in ways a purely toxic version never could. The poison is real, but it only becomes a weapon when it is wired into the whole terrible machine of the complete man. Pull it loose and it is loud and vicious and, at the last, beatable, which is why it loses and gets folded back in. That is why I would not put Toxic Rick on any serious list of variants who could take down C-137, even though, of everyone we discussed tonight, he is stitched from the purest C-137 material. He fails the test the way the Pickle did not, and the contrast teaches you something. When our Rick turned himself into a pickle, the point was that the danger lives in the mind and travels with it into any form, even a condiment on the floor. Toxic Rick is the inverse demonstration. Take that same mind, cut it in half, and neither half is dangerous enough, because the danger was never in the pieces. It lived in the whole, tortured, integrated thing. You cannot beat him by being the best parts of him, and you cannot beat him by being the worst parts of him. You can only beat him by being all of him, and the sole being who was ever all of him, matched top to bottom, ambition and restraint and cruelty and grief, was the one who came from a dimension with no number and dropped a bomb through a portal. Everyone else is a fragment, and fragments lose. There is a small, sad grace note in the Toxic Rick story I do not want to skip past because it deepens the whole idea. The detoxified Rick, the one scrubbed clean of all his poison, is not offered as an improvement either. He is passive, pleasant, and useless. He has lost the drive along with the toxins, and the episode is blunt that this version could no more survive the multiverse than the toxic one could. It is a bleak little thesis about the man. It says the awful parts of our Rick and the functional parts of our Rick cannot be pried apart, that you cannot keep the genius and discard the misery, that the very things that make him monstrous are welded to the things that make him capable. He is a package deal, and the package is unbearable to be, and it is also the only configuration that works at all. That is about as honest a statement as this series ever makes about why he is the way he is, and it arrives disguised as an episode about a day at the spa. The second of the facet Ricks comes closer than anything else to destroying our Rick, and it does not manage it with weapons or armies or a superior intellect. It does it with something far harder to fight, which is happiness. This is Tiny Rick, and his story is one of the eeriest things the series ever attempted, because it suggests that the one force capable of erasing Rick C-137 is not a rival at all. It is a version of himself that simply feels good. The setup is a second season episode in which our Rick, thanks to a school investigation gone sideways, transfers his consciousness into a cloned body, a young, healthy, teenage version of himself. The plan is temporary. He will wear the young body, do what needs doing, then transfer back into his real, aging, worn-out frame once the job is finished. At first it plays as comedy, this ancient, bitter mind strolling around in a fresh teenage body, adored by high schoolers, thriving, having the time of its life. Tiny Rick, as the kids christen him, is popular and electric and, above all, joyful, in a way our real Rick almost never manages. That is where the horror seeps in, slow, tucked under the jokes, because the longer our Rick stays in the young body, the less he wants to climb back out of it. The mechanism is clever and it is dark. The young clone body is not just a container. It has its own biology, its own chemistry, its own instincts, and those instincts belong to a healthy teenager, which means they point toward pleasure and belonging and survival in the present moment. The old mind, poured into the young body, starts to be overwritten by the young body's chemistry. The joy is not really Rick's joy. It is the clone's biology flooding his consciousness with the sensation of being young and alive and untroubled, and that sensation is so much more bearable than being our actual Rick, that our actual Rick begins to dissolve into it. He starts to forget he is trapped. He starts to not want to go back. The clone body is slowly melting the real Rick away, not by force but by comfort, by handing him the one thing he has never once been able to have, which is to feel good in his own skin, and he very nearly lets it swallow him whole. The way the series flags the danger is one of its finest small touches. The trapped, real Rick leaves messages to himself, cries for help buried in songs and scribbles, the part of him that knows he is being erased, trying to reach the part of him that no longer cares. There is a haunting image of the real Rick decaying in the background, while Tiny Rick parties in the foreground, the old self literally rotting, while the young self runs on borrowed chemistry. What makes it land is that Tiny Rick is not evil. He is not scheming to kill our Rick out of malice. He is just happy, and the happiness is enough. The happiness alone is nearly fatal, because our Rick is a man for whom being happy and being himself have always been mutually exclusive, and the clone body dangled a way to be happy by ceasing to be himself, and he almost reached out and took it. So, does Tiny Rick belong on a list of variants who could beat C-137? In the strict sense, no, for the same reason Toxic Rick does not. Tiny Rick is not another Rick. He is our Rick's own consciousness in a different container, a facet, a stunt, a temporary arrangement of the same man. He is not a rival who could defeat C-137 out in the wider multiverse. In a deeper and far more troubling sense, though, Tiny Rick is the closest anything ever comes to actually ending our Rick, and I think it is worth being honest about that, because it says something no fight scene ever could. Rick Prime beat our Rick by stripping away everything he loved and making the loss permanent. Tiny Rick nearly beat our Rick by offering him relief from being himself. Those are the two real ways to destroy this man, and neither one is a duel. One is grief made eternal. The other is comfort made total. He is armored against armies and gadgets and every Rick who ever came for him with a portal gun. He is defenseless against his own unhappiness, from either side, whether it is deepened past bearing or lifted away entirely. What finally breaks the tiny Rick spell is not our Rick's strength. It is a decision, a choice, to surrender the comfort and return to the misery, to climb out of the young body and back into the old, dying one. Because on some level our Rick grasps that the happy version is not really him, and that surviving as himself, dreadful as that is, matters more than melting into a pleasant lie. It is one of the few heroic things he ever does, and it is heroic in a very specific, very sad shape. He chooses to stay the unhappiest version of himself rather than vanish into a happy one. He chooses the pain because the pain is his. That choice, I think, is the truest statement of who our Rick actually is, deeper than any feat of intelligence. He is a man who has been offered happiness and turned it down, more than once, because the happiness on the table always demanded he stop being himself, and he would rather suffer as Rick than be content as anyone else. Rick Prime once offered him the infinite, and he chose his family instead. The clone body offered him youth and joy, and he chose his own rotting frame instead. The through line holds. He keeps choosing to remain himself, at enormous cost, and it keeps costing him everything he has. That is the note I want to close this stretch on, because we have now looked at the pickle, the poison, and the clone. 3 times the series took our Rick apart, or reconfigured him to test what he is made of, and all 3 land on the same conclusion. You cannot find the thing that beats C-137 inside C-137, because every piece of him, isolated, is either less dangerous than the whole, or more seductive than the whole, and neither the fragment nor the temptation can actually fill in for a true external rival. The facets are the writers playing with their own action figure, pulling the arms off to see how it works. They fascinate, and they tell you an enormous amount about the character, but they are not answers to the title. For a real answer, we have to step back out into the actual multiverse, to the Ricks who are not slivers of ours but their own men, and ask whether any of them, on any single axis, ever edged him out. Out there, in that catalog of true other Ricks, one has a far better claim than his reputation suggests. A Rick the whole Citadel treats as a joke, and who may secretly be the shrewdest overlooked mind in the entire series. His name, cruelly enough, is Doofus Rick, and he is the Rick the other Ricks brand as the stupid one, the punchline of the Citadel, the variant they all agree is beneath them. I want to make a real argument in this chapter, not just walk through a recap, because I think Doofus Rick has a stronger claim to being dangerous than almost anyone grants him, and the reason nobody sees it is the exact blind spot that once let a Morty break the entire Rick system. The Ricks cannot recognize a threat that does not look like a Rick, and Doofus Rick does not look like a Rick. He looks like a joke. That is precisely why he might be the single sharpest variant in the whole catalog, hiding in plain sight. He first turns up in the same first season episode that introduces the Citadel, the one with the eye patch Morty, and he is framed as comic relief, a soft, gentle, socially awkward Rick the others openly bully. There is a running insult the other Ricks hurl at him, a crude jab about him eating his own waste, and I want to be careful and clear here, because it is a thing people repeat as fact when it is nothing of the kind. That insult is bullying. It is the other Ricks being vicious, not a literal description of anything Doofus Rick actually does. The creators themselves have addressed it, in commentary, and the whole point of the joke is the cruelty of the Ricks who say it, not any real behavior of the Rick they say it about. So set the insult aside completely. It tells you nothing about Doofus Rick except that his brothers are savage, which we already knew. What actually defines Doofus Rick, once you peel away how the others treat him, is 2 things, and both are remarkable. The first is that he is kind. Unmistakably, patiently kind, in a way that is nearly unique among Ricks. He builds a real friendship with Jerry, of all people, the family member every other Rick holds in bottomless contempt, and he does it not as part of some scheme, but because he is a warm person who enjoys another person's company. In a species defined by arrogance and cruelty and the inability to connect, Doofus Rick can connect. He has the one thing the whole species could not grow, and that our Rick spent his life sprinting away from, which is the capacity for uncomplicated affection. That is not nothing. In the emotional economy of this series, it is close to a superpower. because it is the exact thing the strongest Rick of all lost and never once got back. The second thing, and this is the one that should make you seriously reconsider him, is that Doofus Rick is not stupid in the slightest. He is, by some measures, doing science the other Ricks would not even attempt. There is a detail from his corner of the lore I find remarkable every time it crosses my mind. Doofus Rick worked out a way to travel between dimensions without a portal gun. He improvised a substance, a kind of portal fluid, a chemical route to interdimensional travel that sidesteps the entire technology every other Rick leans on. Sit with what that means in context for a second. The portal gun is the crown jewel of Rick technology. It is the device our Rick built after losing his family, the thing that defines the whole species, the reason Ricks can be Ricks across realities at all. Here is the Rick everyone calls an idiot, casually engineering an alternative to it, a way to do the impossible thing without the impossible device, using chemistry the others were not creative enough or humble enough to chase. That is not the work of a lesser mind. That is the work of a mind coming at the problem from an angle the arrogant Ricks were too proud to even consider. So let me lay the argument out plainly, and flag clearly that it is an argument, an interpretation, not something the series states outright. I think Doofus Rick is a sly suggestion that intelligence and cruelty are not the same thing, and that the Ricks have confused the two. The Citadel measures Rickness by arrogance, by ruthlessness, by the willingness to treat everything as beneath you, and by that measure Doofus Rick fails, because he is gentle and warm and hopeless at contempt. But if you measure by actual capability, by originality, by the ability to crack a problem nobody else could crack, Doofus Rick is operating at the highest level there is, and he is doing it without any of the poison that keeps the other Ricks so miserable. He is, in a sense, the living counterexample to the whole tragedy of our Rick. He proves a Rick can be brilliant and kind at once, that the genius never had to come welded to the cruelty, that the misery was a choice, or an accident, and not a requirement. The other Ricks hate him for it, because his existence is an accusation. Every time they look at Doofus Rick being decent and clever and content, they are staring at proof that they did not have to become what they became. Could he beat C-137? In a straight fight, of course not, and it would be foolish to pretend otherwise. Doofus Rick has no appetite for fighting anyone, and if our Rick decided to end him, he would end him the way he ends most things, fast and without ceremony. But I want to complicate the question, because I do not think the interesting version of it has anything to do with fighting. If the question is which Rick holds something our Rick truly lacks, something our Rick could never win back no matter how clever he gets, then Doofus Rick has a stronger claim than nearly anyone on this whole list. He has the thing the Omega device made permanently impossible for our Rick to have, which is the ability to love someone simply and be loved back, without it curdling into a wound. Our Rick is the most capable Rick in the multiverse, and he is alone, and his loneliness is a life sentence. Doofus Rick is bullied and belittled and underestimated, and he has a friend, and he is at peace. On the single axis our Rick can never win, the axis of being able to actually live with himself, the Doofus beats the genius without even trying. I think the series knows it, and I think that is why it keeps him around. A soft reminder tucked into the corner of the cruelest civilization ever put on screen, that being the smartest is not the same as being all right, and that the Rick everyone laughs at might be the only one of them who genuinely made it out. That is the edge case, the Rick whose victory is invisible because it is not counted in kills or in intelligence, but in something the other Ricks decided did not count at all. Once you have caught it in Doofus Rick, you start to notice he is not the only Rick who won a game the others were not even playing. There is another one, further out in the multiverse, a Rick who did not just make peace inside a cruel system, but who somehow ended up with the entire thing our Rick lost. The family, the warmth, the good life, all of it, intact and unbroken. He is barely in the series at all. He appears for a moment and is gone. But that single appearance is one of the truest things it ever offered, because it is an admission that somewhere out there, a Rick got to be happy, and that he did it not by being stronger than ours, but by being spared the one thing that broke him. The Rick who got to be happy comes from a place Rick and Morty calls the Wasp universe, and he is one of the strangest, gentlest things the series ever briefly showed you. In a world where every Rick is a variation on misery, this one is a variation on peace. He appears for only a short while, tied to an adventure our Rick and Morty stumble into, and the premise of his reality is exactly what it sounds like. It is a universe where humanity, or the version of it that includes the Smith family, evolved from wasps instead of primates. Everyone there is a wasp person. That biological detail, played partly for the sheer absurdity of it, turns out to be the least interesting thing about him. The important thing about Wasp Rick is not that he is a wasp. It is that he is kind and settled and surrounded by a family that loves him, and that he seems, genuinely, to be doing fine. Wasp Rick is the same brilliant scientist our Rick is. He has the mind, he has the capability. What he does not have is the wound. In his universe, whatever combination of tragedy and cruelty and loss made our Rick into the man we follow simply did not happen, or happened differently, and the result is a Rick who kept his family and his warmth, a Rick who is affectionate with his Morty and his Beth, a Rick who treats the people around him like people rather than tools or camouflage or obstacles. When he meets our Rick, he is not a rival, and he is not a threat. If anything, he is kind to him, which our Rick has almost no idea how to process, because kindness from another version of himself is not something his entire existence has prepared him for. Wasp Rick looks at our Rick and sees, I think, exactly what our Rick could have been, and he does not gloat about it, which somehow makes it worse. Let me be careful about what Rick and Morty actually establishes versus what I am reading into the encounter, because Wasp Rick is a minor character, and it would be easy to build a cathedral on a cameo. What the episode gives you is straightforward. A Rick from a universe of wasp people who is a good and happy family man. That is the fact. The interpretation, which I offer as mine, is that Wasp Rick exists to make a single devastating point about our Rick, and the point is that the misery was never necessary. Our Rick's whole self-image depends on the idea that being this smart makes you this miserable, that the genius and the loneliness and the cruelty are a package that cannot be pulled apart, that anyone who saw the universe as clearly as he does would end up as broken as he is. Wasp Rick is the counterexample that demolishes that story without ever raising its voice. The same intelligence, the same species-level genius, lives in a Rick who is warm and loved and whole. The intelligence did not doom him. Something else did the dooming to ours. Something specific. A bomb in a garage, and a device that erased a woman from every reality. And Wasp Rick is the proof that without those particular wounds, a Rick can be a decent and happy man. Which means that on the question of whether Wasp Rick could beat C-137, the honest answer is the same as it was for Doofus Rick, and it is more interesting than a flat no. In a fight, of course not. Wasp Rick has no reason to fight and no inclination toward it, and if it came to violence, our Rick would win, because winning at violence is the one thing our Rick is best in the multiverse at. But that is not the game Wasp Rick is playing, and it is not the game he wins. He beats our Rick at the only game our Rick has already lost and can never win back, the game of having a life worth living. He has the family our Rick had taken from him. He has the peace our Rick traded away and then had erased. He has the thing the Omega device made permanently impossible for our Rick to recover. On that scoreboard, the only scoreboard our Rick actually cares about underneath all the science and all the killing, Wasp Rick is not losing to C-137. He is winning by an incomprehensible margin, and he does not even know it, because to him it is simply his ordinary life. There is a particular kind of ache in the Wasp Rick encounter that I keep coming back to, and it is different from the ache of Rick Prime or the ache of Simple Rick. Rick Prime is the version of our Rick who chose power and became a monster. Simple Rick is the version who chose family and got harvested for it. Wasp Rick is the version who chose family and simply got to keep it. No punishment, no catch, no bomb, just a Rick who wanted a good life and was allowed to have one. The cruelty of him, the reason his brief appearance lands so hard, is that he demonstrates it was possible. Somewhere in the infinite multiverse, a Rick got everything our Rick wanted and lost, and he got it not by being cleverer or stronger, but by being lucky, by being spared. The difference between our Rick's ruin and Wasp Rick's contentment is not a difference in ability, it is a difference in what happened to them. And our Rick, who built an entire philosophy around the idea that nothing matters and everyone is doomed, has to stand in a room with living proof that a version of him is happy, and there is nothing his enormous intelligence can do with that fact except look at it. So Wasp Rick joins Doofus Rick in a small, strange category that I think is the real hidden subject of this whole video. The category of Ricks who beat C-137 at the only thing that matters, by losing at everything the Citadel measures. Neither of them could take him in a fight. Neither is smarter, in the raw sense, or more dangerous, or better equipped. But both have what he cannot have, and both are at peace in a way he will never be, and if you define beating a man not as ending his life, but as living a better one than his, then the Doofus and the Wasp are two of the very few beings in the entire series who, quietly, without ever trying, come out ahead of Rick C-137. That inversion is worth staying with for a moment, because it turns the whole premise of the title inside out. The Ricks who could actually beat C-137 in the way that would hurt him most are not the strong ones or the smart ones. They are the happy ones, and there are almost none of them, and the reason there are almost none of them is the curve, and the reason our Rick is not among them is a device with Diane's name on it. The strongest Rick in the multiverse was beaten, decisively and permanently, by the ones who got to keep their families, and he knows it every time he meets one, and he can never say so. There is one more unusual Rick worth spending time with before we start closing the case. And he is unusual in a way none of the others are, because he is not really a whole person, and he is not from another dimension. He is a memory. The fandom calls him Memory Rick. He is a fragment of our Rick that ended up living inside somebody else's mind. And his strange little arc across the later seasons is one of the tenderest, most overlooked pieces of business the series ever ran. And it circles back, in the end, to the same theme everything else tonight has circled back to. The theme of what our Rick lost, and how he keeps trying to store the parts of himself he cannot bear to lose. To understand Memory Rick, you have to remember our Rick's oldest friend, Bird Person, the warrior comrade from the days before the series begins, who over the course of Rick and Morty is gravely wounded and rebuilt into a cybernetic form. At one point, the story travels inside Bird Person's mind, into the landscape of his memories, and there, living among them, is a version of Rick. Not the real Rick, but Bird Person's memory of him, an impression of the man from their shared past. A younger Rick, preserved as his friend remembered him, still carrying the weight of the wars they fought together. This Memory Rick is a person in his own right inside that mental world, with his own continuity and his own fixations, a little piece of the past that kept living after the moment that made it had gone. And through a chain of events I will not walk through in full, this fragment of Rick eventually gets dislodged from where he belongs and ends up somewhere he very much does not, stuck inside the mind of Jerry, of all people, the least Rick-like consciousness imaginable, a memory of the smartest man in the universe marooned in the head of the family's most ordinary member. I find the whole idea lovely, and a little heartbreaking, because of what it says about how our Rick exists in the world. Most people leave memories in other minds as a matter of course, ordinary impressions that fade. Our Rick leaves a version of himself so vivid and so complete that it becomes an actual character, a self-sustaining fragment with opinions and fears and a story of its own. That is partly a joke about how large he looms in the lives of everyone around him, but it is also something sadder. Memory Rick is a piece of our Rick from before the worst of it, or at least from a different chapter of it, preserved in amber inside his friend, and the fact that this fragment can be knocked loose and lost and shuffled from mind to mind is its own small tragedy. Even the memories of him are unstable. Even the pieces of him that other people carry are subject to the same chaos and displacement that defines the rest of his existence. And then, years later, in the finale of the 8th season, an episode called Hot Rick, the series does something I did not see coming, which is pull Memory Rick back into the actual story. By that point, our Rick is trying, in his own broken way, to move past Diane, and the method is pure Rick. He decides to delete her from his own mind, to cut out the last memory he has of her, so that the grief will finally stop steering him. The trouble is that this memory is not nothing. It is the one faint image of Diane that slipped past the Omega device, the single scrap the weapon somehow missed, and Memory Rick, still adrift after all these years, finds it. What follows is quietly awful. He starts altering the family's memories, working his way through Jerry's head and then Beth's, trying to save that last impression of Diane, and his rescue very nearly kills both Beths along the way. In the end, our Rick does not destroy him. He gathers up Memory Rick and the surviving memory of Diane, and he sends the two of them off together into an empty pocket of space, a little farm of their own, so that the fragment of himself and the ghost of his wife can live out, somewhere far away, the ending the real Rick never got and never will. It is a strange, aching resolution, and it is the sort of deep continuity this series keeps careful track of, even in the middle of its chaos. A small, odd character introduced seasons earlier, a piece left behind in a friend's ruined mind, comes back at the very end to become the vehicle for our Rick finally, partially, letting go. Now, is Memory Rick a Rick who could beat C-137? No. And it would be almost cruel to pretend the question applies to him, because he is not built for it, and it is not what he is for. He is not a rival. He is not a threat. He is a relic, a preserved impression, a piece of our Rick's past given a strange half-life. But I include him, and I include him on purpose, because he completes a picture that the roster of dangerous Ricks leaves out. All night we have been asking who is strong enough or smart enough or ruthless enough to beat our Rick, and the answer has kept collapsing back to almost nobody, and the few near answers, Rick Prime and Evil Morty, are the ones who beat him by taking things away. Memory Rick points at the opposite truth. Our Rick is not only a man who can be beaten by loss, he is also a man so vivid, so overwhelming, so present, that pieces of him take on lives of their own and persist in the minds of the people who knew him. He is impossible to fully lose, even for his enemies, even for himself. The same intensity that makes him unbeatable in a fight makes him unforgettable as a person, and Memory Rick is that idea made literal, the largeness of the character turned into an actual character. There is a reading here about grief and memory that I think is the real reason the series keeps returning to this fragment, and I offer it as a reading. Our Rick spends the whole run unable to let go of the past, keeping his home dimension frozen on the worst day of his life, hunting a man for decades, eventually building a robot of a woman who was erased from every reality. He is a man who cannot release what he has lost. Memory Rick is the mirror image of that compulsion. He is a piece of the past that will not release him, a version of himself that keeps coming back, that will not stay lost no matter how far it drifts. The man who cannot let go is haunted by a fragment that will not let go of him, and there is something almost merciful in that symmetry, because it means that for all his loneliness, for all the people and versions of himself he has lost, our Rick is never entirely alone in the way he fears. He is too large to fully disappear, even from the inside of his oldest friend's ruined mind. So Memory Rick sits outside the fight entirely, and that is exactly why he belongs in an honest accounting of the Ricks who orbit C-137. Not every important Rick is a weapon. Some of them are wounds, and some of them are memories, and some of them are the small, tender proof that a man this monstrous was also, once, someone worth remembering fondly enough that the memory refused to die. With him accounted for, we can turn to the last handful of variants, the cameos and the one-line legends, the Ricks who flash across the screen for a moment and leave a whole mythology behind them, before we finally close the book and give the title the honest verdict it deserves. The multiverse of Ricks is enormous, and most of them never get a story at all. They flash past for a second. A face in a crowd on the Citadel, a variant in a funny hat, a background joke you only catch on a second viewing, and then they are gone. Yet a handful of these cameo Ricks have grown whole clouds of speculation around them, precisely because Rick and Morty tells you almost nothing about them, and the almost nothing is so tantalizing. So before we close, let me sweep up a few of these one-line legends, the Ricks, who are barely characters at all and whom fans have turned into myths. I want to be honest about which of them amount to anything, and which are only the series playing with its own crowd. Start with the first season's parade of Citadel Ricks. When Rick and Morty first cracked open the idea of infinite variants, it packed the frame with them for the sheer fun of it, and two have lodged themselves in the collective memory. One is a Rick dressed as a cowboy, a Western Rick, silent, simply present, a hat and a duster adrift in a sea of lab coats. He does nothing. He says nothing. That is exactly why people love him, because you are handed the implication of an entire life, a whole reality where a Rick became a gunslinger and then denied a single detail about it. The other is better still, a Rick styled after the musician Prince, a flamboyant tribute the creators call, in their own materials, the scientist formerly known as Rick. He is glimpsed for only a beat, and he is already a corpse when we see him, because he was one of the victims in a string of Rick murders that runs underneath that first season episode. More than 24 Ricks were killed, 27 of them, and our Rick was framed for every one, dragged in front of the council to answer for a slaughter he did not commit. The real killer, as we saw earlier, was Evil Rick, the lobotomized puppet with a Morty's hand inside him. So the fearsome body count that hangs over that stretch of the Citadel does not belong to some hidden Super Rick at all. It belongs to a dead man being steered by remote control. I love that detail, and I want to use it to make a point about the whole category, because it is a perfect example of how a myth gets born. Consider what you are actually told. A Rick with a reputation for killing many of his own, already dead. That is the whole of it. From those two little facts, your mind builds a story on its own, a rise and a fall, a killer Rick who ran up a body count and then met his own end. A full tragedy folded into a single background gag. But the honest thing, the thing the omission rule forces me to say plainly, is that none of that story is on the screen. What you are given is a rumor and a corpse. Everything else is you, filling in the blanks. Because you were trained to assume that any Rick with a body count must have a saga behind him. That assumption is usually wrong. Most of these cameo Ricks are precisely what they look like, a costume and a joke, and the deep histories fans dream up for them are fan fiction, and a careful narrator has to be willing to say so rather than recite the fan fiction as though it were canon. So if you were tempted to file that Prince tribute away as some secret killer Rick, a variant fearsome enough to trouble ours, the honest reply is that the killings were never his to begin with, and the one who did carry them out was a puppet, not a rival. Set the numbers side by side anyway. Our Rick's record, the war, the assassination squad, the council, is shown on screen or fixed firmly in the lore, demonstrated rather than whispered. The 27 dead of that first season were a frame job, a crime staged to be pinned on him, and the true author of it could not think for himself at all. And even if you handed some ordinary Rick a tally of 24 fallen brothers, it would still leave him nowhere near ours, the one who cut down a strike team of 5 elite Ricks as a footnote and gutted the leadership of an entire civilization while chasing something else entirely. 24 and more is a nightmare by the measure of any ordinary being. Set against C-137, it is a rounding error. Then there is a different sort of cameo Rick, one who matters not because of a rumor, but because of a real event in the history of Rick and Morty, and that is the Rick tied to the Cronenberg world. Early in the first season, in the episode where the love potion goes wrong, our Rick ruins an entire version of Earth, warping its whole population into grotesque, monstrous shapes, and rather than fix what he broke, he and his Morty simply abandon that reality and relocate to a fresh one, burying the dead versions of themselves in the backyard and stepping into their lives. The world they left behind, that ruined place crawling with mutants, becomes a recurring piece of the geography, the Cronenberg dimension, and there is a Rick bound up with it, a Rick and a Morty who fled the wreck our Rick made. Let me tread carefully around the dimension labels here, because this is one of the spots where the record has been deliberately muddied, and the numbering fans lean on does not always agree with itself. So I will keep to what is solid. There is a world our Rick destroyed and walked away from. The consequences of that ruin linger, and the Ricks bound to it are less rivals than they are victims and witnesses. Living reminders that our Rick's casual cruelty leaves whole realities smashed behind him, dimensions full of suffering he created and then chose never to think about again. That, I think, is the real value of the Cronenberg material to our question, and it has nothing to do with combat. It is about the scale of consequence. When we ask who could beat C-137, we tend to picture a duel, two Ricks squaring off across a room. But the Cronenberg world reframes the whole thing, because it reminds you what our Rick does to the realities he merely passes through. He does not simply win fights, he leaves ruin. A whole Earth mutated and abandoned because a scheme went sideways, and repairing it was more bother than moving house. That is the kind of thing that makes the kill count almost beside the point. What is most dangerous about our Rick is not that he can beat any given opponent. It is that beating opponents sits so far beneath his concerns that he will unmake a world by accident and never glance back. A Rick who could beat him in a straight fight would still have to reckon with the fact that fighting is not really where his danger lives. His danger lives in his indifference, in the ease with which he wrecks things, in the total absence of any break on what he will do to a reality that has stopped being useful to him. So the cameo Ricks, taken all together, give us the final texture of the roster, and it is a humbling one. A silent cowboy who is pure implication. A Prince tribute murdered to frame our Rick, already a corpse before the story starts. A ruined Cronenberg world littered with the wreckage our Rick left in his wake. Not one of them is a rival. Every one of them is Rick and Morty, reminding you how vast and how offhand the horror of this character is. How many Ricks there are, and how little any of them add up to next to ours. How many worlds he has brushed against and how few survived the brushing. And that, at last, carries us to the end of the accounting, to the point where we have looked at the equals and the pretenders and the fragments and the ghosts and the cameos, and can finally answer the question the title asked, honestly and completely, without flinching from how short the true answer turns out to be. Before I give the final verdict, I want to spend one chapter honestly indulging the version of this question that lives in the fandom rather than in the canon, because it is a fun question, and because being honest about it means being clear about where the canon stops and where fan imagination begins. If Rick Prime is the only Rick the story actually proves could beat C-137, then plenty of viewers naturally ask the next thing. What would it take? If you were designing, from nothing, a Rick built to beat ours, what would you have to give him? Let me walk through that as a thought experiment, flagged clearly as speculation and nothing more, because the answer tells you a great deal about why the canon roster is so short. The first thing you would have to solve is the intelligence problem, and it is the one the Central Finite Curve makes nearly impossible to solve from the inside. To beat our Rick with a plan, you have to outthink him, and outthinking him means being the smarter mind in the room. And inside the curve, by its very design, no Rick is permitted to be smarter than the reference Rick. So any challenger raised inside the wall is capped before he begins. This is why, in the honest fan version of the question, people always end up reaching outside the curve, imagining a Rick from the unfiltered multiverse, a Rick from one of the realities the wall discarded, a Rick who was never selected for and so was never held down. It is a fascinating idea. But notice what it costs you. The instant you step outside the curve for your challenger, you are no longer talking about a Rick, in the sense the story means, a member of the great Citadel population. You are talking about some other genius from some other reality who happens to wear the same face. The curve arranges things so that any Rick worthy of the name cannot beat C-137, and any being who could beat C-137 is, almost by definition, not one of the Ricks the curve protects. Rick Prime is the loophole, the Rick who sits outside the tidy scheme with no tidy number to file him under, and that is exactly why he works and exactly why he stands alone. The second thing you would have to solve is the decisiveness problem, and this is where Rick Prime's particular toolkit becomes the template for anything that could beat our Rick. Our Rick wins fights by finishing them before they begin. To beat him, you cannot let him land the first decisive move, which means you need one of three things. You need to be faster than he is, or able to survive the blow he does land, or already moving before he starts. Rick Prime solved all three at once. The cybernetics make him quick and durable enough to absorb a strike that would end an ordinary Rick. The regeneration means even a decisive wound stops being decisive. and the planning across time and across decoys kept him several moves ahead before our Rick had even pinned down where he was. If you set out to engineer a Rick to beat ours, you would essentially be reverse engineering Rick Prime, because Rick Prime is what the solution looks like once you finish drawing it. That is no coincidence. The writers built the one Rick who beats ours by handing him precisely the counters to everything that makes ours unbeatable. And the fact that it took every one of those counters at once tells you how few Ricks could ever hold them all together. The third thing, and this is the one the fan versions almost always miss, is the willingness problem. Beating our Rick is not only a matter of capability, it is a matter of wanting it badly enough and coldly enough at the same time. Most Ricks who came for him were driven by rage, by grief, by wounded pride, and rage and grief make you predictable, and predictable is death against a mind like his. The prison of failed hunters we spoke about earlier is packed with Ricks who wanted him, or wanted Prime, with their whole hearts, and wanting it that much is part of why they failed, because our Rick and Rick Prime both turn other people's feelings into weapons. Rick Prime was different not because he wanted it more, but because he wanted it less. He was cold about it. Our Rick was an afterthought to him rather than an obsession. That detachment is itself a weapon, and it is one almost no other Rick carries, because almost every other Rick's relationship to C-137 is soaked through with feeling. To beat our Rick, you would have to stop caring whether you beat him, and caring that little is rarer among this species of wounded narcissists than any gadget you could bolt on. There is a fourth requirement as well, and it is the one I find quietly terrifying, because it has nothing to do with strength or intelligence or coldness. It is the unpredictability problem. Our Rick is not only smarter and more ruthless than his challengers, he is truly erratic, self-destructive in ways that are almost impossible to plan around, willing to lose in the short term in ways that make no sense until you realize he never cared about the short term at all. He will let himself be captured. He will turn himself into a pickle. He will stroll into a Federation prison as bait. A challenger trying to outplan him has to plan not against a rational actor, but against a man who might inflict something catastrophic on himself simply because it amuses him, or because he has stopped caring whether he lives. And an opponent like that cannot be modeled, because every model assumes a will to live that our Rick does not reliably possess. Rick Prime, notice, never once tried to outplan our Rick inside a single confrontation. He hid, he ran, he seeded decoys and stayed away for decades. And I think that is because even Rick Prime, his intellectual equal, understood that you do not beat this man by predicting him in the moment. You beat him by never being in the room with him at all until the moment you absolutely must. The unpredictability is armor, and it is armor made of not much wanting to be alive, which is the darkest advantage any character in this story has ever carried. Now let me be very clear about the status of everything I have just said, because it matters. That was a thought experiment. It is my own reasoning about what the canon implies, built out of the pattern established with Rick Prime, and fans have assembled all sorts of versions of it, some far more elaborate than mine. None of it is a claim that any specific extra Rick exists who could beat C-137. The canon offers no such Rick. Go looking online and you will find endless battle scenarios, Ricks ranked and rated and pitted against one another with confident numbers attached, and I will say plainly that almost every one of those numbers is invented, pulled from fan battle wikis rather than from anything the story actually laid down. What you are given is qualities, not statistics. You are told that Rick Prime is cybernetically enhanced, that he regenerates, that he masters time. You are not told his strength on a scale of 1 to 10, and anyone who quotes you such a figure is guessing. So enjoy the thought experiment for what it is, a way of understanding why the canon answer is the size it is, and do not mistake it for extra canon. The map of Ricks who could beat C-137 holds exactly one confirmed location, and everything else is the pleasure of speculating about the empty space around that single point. What the thought experiment reveals, and the reason I wanted to run it at all, is something I find genuinely moving. Every last requirement for beating our Rick turns out to be a description of a wound. To beat him, you need to come from outside the system that broke him, or you need the exact cold detachment of the man who broke him, or you need to have solved the precise vulnerabilities his grief and his brilliance carved into him. Lay the blueprint out flat, and it is basically a portrait of Rick Prime, which means the only being who could truly beat our Rick was the one who had already decided, long ago, that love was a weakness and family a mistake, and who had built his entire self around that decision. The reason our Rick is nearly unbeatable is the same reason he is miserable. He is a man who chose to feel something, once, and was destroyed for it, and the only force in the multiverse able to destroy him again is a version of himself who never made that choice at all. That is the shape of the answer. It is time to state it, cleanly and without any more hedging, and then to let the whole thing go and drift off, because we have finally reached the end of the accounting. There is one more thing to clear up before the verdict, because it sits underneath this entire subject, and it trips people constantly, and it is the question of which Rick our Rick even is. That sounds like it should have a simple answer. For a long time, the series let you assume it did, and then it spent years deliberately muddying the water, and being honest about that muddiness is part of getting the whole thing right. So let me lay out what is solid and what is not, carefully, because the temptation to overspecify is strongest right here, at the one spot where a confident guess does the most damage. What is solid is this. Our Rick is Rick C-137. That designation has been attached to him from early on, the label that marks him as the specific Rick whose Diane and whose original Beth were killed by the bomb, the one who built the portal gun for revenge, the one who sits at the exact middle of the walled multiverse as the Rickest Rick. When we say C-137, we mean him, the grandfather we follow, and that much the canon supports firmly. Also solid is that Rick Prime does not come from the same place. Prime is from the prime dimension, the reality with no numeric designation at all, and that is a different origin entirely, which is the whole reason the two of them are distinct beings rather than one. Keep those two facts and you will not go badly wrong. Where it gets slippery is the family we actually watch every week, and specifically, whether the Beth and the Jerry and the Summer, and even the Morty in that house, started out in C-137's own reality or somewhere else. The writers have been mischievously unclear about this, to the point where the confusion became a running theme rather than a mistake to be corrected. The reading the evidence best supports is that the original Beth, C-137's biological daughter, died with Diane in the bomb, and that the adult Beth, whose household our Rick shares, is an alternate Beth from another dimension, a version of his daughter he moved in with, rather than the little girl he actually lost. He is living out a second draft of fatherhood with a Beth who is not quite his, playing grandfather to a family that is a near copy of the one taken from him. That much I am comfortable stating. What I will not do is pin precise dimension numbers on our Morty, or on the household, or draw a clean map of exactly who moved where and when, because the sources conflict and the series refuses to settle it, and a confident number there would be an invention wearing the costume of a fact. Let me dwell on why Rick and Morty does this, because it is not laziness and it is not a continuity error. It is a choice, and it speaks straight to our whole subject. In a multiverse of infinite Ricks, the question of which one is the real one is supposed to be unanswerable, and the writing keeps it that way on purpose. There is a famous early moment where our Rick tells his Morty, more or less, that he is not even his real grandfather, that the whole idea of an original is a comfort the multiverse does not actually provide. The blur around C-137's identity is the series living up to that line. Point to one Rick and call him the true, foundational Rick, with everyone else a copy, and you have knocked the legs out from under the entire premise. The horror and the freedom both come from the fact that there is no fact of the matter. Every Rick is somebody's original and somebody's copy. The labels are a bookkeeping convenience laid over an infinity that does not care about them, and that bears directly on who could beat C-137, in a way that is easy to miss. Part of what makes him so hard to beat is that he does not fully believe in his own singularity, and the disbelief works like armor. He treats himself as disposable, one of infinitely many, so he takes risks no one who prized their single life would take. A being who thinks he is unique and irreplaceable fights carefully, because losing means losing everything. Our Rick fights like a man who long ago decided he is nothing special, one Rick among endless Ricks, and that freedom from self-preservation makes him more dangerous, not less. The muddied identity is not only a lore puzzle, it is part of the character's power. He is hard to beat, partly because he has stopped caring whether this particular version of him lives through the day. So when someone asks which Rick could beat C-137, and you feel the urge to answer with great precision about dimensions and designations, remember that the series itself declined to be precise about the simplest version of that question, which is, which Rick C-137 even is? The honest move is to hold the solid facts firmly. Our Rick is C-137. The bomb took his real family. Rick Prime is a separate being from an unnumbered dimension. And to hold everything else loosely, because the writing holds it loosely too, and because a vague truth beats a specific invention every time. That discipline, more than any single piece of lore, is what separates an honest accounting of this character from the confident nonsense you can find in 100 other places. And with it in hand, we can finally give the verdict. So here is the honest verdict, laid out as plainly as I can lay it, after everything we have walked through tonight. The title of this video is a promise to go through every Rick who could actually beat C-137. And the truthful accounting of that promise is that the real list, the one built on what the series establishes rather than what fans imagine, contains exactly one name: Rick Prime. That is it. That is the whole roster the show presents as capable of beating our Rick. Everyone else we discussed is here for a different reason, as an angle, a facet, a pretender, a proxy, or a Rick who beats him at a game he was never playing. But if the question is who could outfight, outplan, and outlast Rick C-37, the canon answer is a roster of one, and that shortness is not lazy writing. It is the entire architecture of the fiction. Let me gather the reasons, because they have accumulated over the last few hours, and they deserve to be held together at the end. The Central Finite Curve guarantees that no ordinary Rick inside it out thinks the reference Rick, which is ours, and that caps every challenger drawn from the Citadel population before the fight even begins. The war, the assassination squad, and the council massacre demonstrate, in escalating order, that numbers do not help. Being more Ricks just means more of the same limits. A coalition, an elite team, and an entire government all came for him, and all of them lost. The facets, Toxic Rick and Tiny Rick and the Pickle, show that you cannot find the thing that beats him by taking him apart, because every piece is either less than the whole or a temptation rather than a rival. The underclass Ricks, the cop and the magnate and poor simple Rick in his factory, show that Citadel society is a machine for producing defeated Ricks, caged one way or another, none of them free enough to be a threat. The cameos are rumors and costumes. And the two beings who truly threaten him, Rick Prime and Evil Morty, threaten him by standing outside the system. One a Rick born, where the dimensions have no number, the other not a Rick at all. Every road leads to the same place. To beat C-137, you have to come from outside the thing that made him, and almost nothing does. Even Rick Prime, the one real answer, arrives with the asterisk that has run under this whole video, and I will state it one final time so it is unmistakable. Prime beat our Rick on the day of the bomb, comprehensively. He took the family, and through the Omega device he took away forever the possibility of getting any version of them back, in any reality, because that weapon erased every Diane across the entire multiverse and rewrote the memory of her. There is no world our Rick can travel to where she survived, and there never will be. That is the beating that defines the series. But when our Rick struck back, at the very end, he did not do it alone, and this is the part the fandom most often gets wrong. He did it with the help of Evil Morty, a Morty who had already punched a hole in the Central Finite Curve, and he landed the final blow with his bare hands, only because that Morty had already pinned the man in place for him. Take the Morty away, and Rick Prime walks. The sharpest mind in the multiverse could not put down his one true equal without help from outside the entire Rick system. That is not a knock on our Rick. It is the writing being honest about how matched the two of them were, about how much it costs to beat a genuine equal, and about how a victory can be total and still leave you holding nothing. Because that is the last thing, the thing I want to leave you with before we drift off. And it is why this question is so much richer than it looks. When you ask which Ricks could beat C-137, you are really asking two questions wearing the same coat. One is the fighting question, the tournament question, and its answer is short and clean, and we have given it. Rick Prime, and no one else, with a Morty's help required even then. The other question, the one hiding underneath, asks what it would even mean to beat a man like this, and its answer is stranger and sadder and much longer. Because the Ricks who actually come out ahead of C-137, the ones who have what he cannot have, are not the strong ones. They are Doofus Rick with his one true friend. They are Wasp Rick with his intact and loving family. The gentle ones. The ones who kept, or never lost, the thing our Rick traded away and then had erased. They could never beat him in a fight, and they would never want to try, and yet on the only scoreboard our Rick secretly cares about, the scoreboard of whether a life is worth living, they are so far ahead of him that he cannot look at them straight. The Ricks who beat C-137 at fighting number exactly 1, the Ricks who beat him at living number a handful, and every one of them managed it by being spared the wound that made him what he is. That contradiction is, I think, the whole show in miniature, and it is why the thing has lasted as long as it has. Rick and Morty spends 9 seasons building the most capable character in the history of animated science fiction. A man who cannot be beaten, who unmakes governments out of boredom and survives as a pickle and outplans his own equals across decades. And then it spends those same 9 seasons insisting, softly and without mercy, that all of that capability bought him nothing. The strongest Rick in the multiverse is the least happy one. The very things that make him impossible to beat are the things that make him impossible to save. The genius is the loneliness. The invincibility is the grief. He built a wall around the multiverse to guarantee he would always be the smartest, and being the smartest turned out to be a life sentence, and the only person who could ever truly beat him was the Rick who decided, long before any of this, that people were not worth the risk. To beat C-137, you have to be Rick Prime, and to be Rick Prime, you have to have already killed the part of yourself that could ever be happy. That is the price of the title. Almost nobody can pay it. The one who could is a monster, and our Rick, for all his darkness, was never quite willing to become him, which is the closest thing to hope the series ever offers about the man. So the next time you meet the title of a video like this one, a promise of every Rick who could beat the main one, I hope you hear it a little differently, because the honest version of the answer is not a power ranking. It is a portrait of a man who made himself unbeatable, and paid for it with everything that would have made being unbeatable worth anything. The roster is one name long. The tragedy underneath it runs the length of the whole series. And the reason we keep coming back to this character, the reason he holds up under this much scrutiny, is that beneath all the multiverse machinery and all the science fiction noise, he is just a person who lost the thing he loved and could not stop running from it, and who found that being the smartest man in infinity does not help with that at all. Not even a little. Not in any reality. Not ever. Rick and Morty arrived as a crude, chaotic little cartoon that looked like it existed mostly to be quoted, and it grew, season by season, into one of the strangest and most ambitious pieces of serialized storytelling on television, willing to build an entire cosmology just to say something true about grief and intelligence and the cost of refusing to let go. It gave us a hero who is also the villain of his own life, a multiverse rigged in his favor that made him miserable anyway, and a single true rival who proved that the only way to beat a man that guarded is to have already given up on everything that makes a life worth guarding. That is a lot of weight for a story that started with a drunk grandfather dragging his grandson through a portal. And the fact that it carries the weight at all is why we are still here, years later, talking about which version of a cartoon scientist could beat which other version, and finding underneath the question something that actually aches. So let the answer be small and let it be honest. One Rick could actually beat C-137, and he did, and beating him back did not fix a single thing, and the Ricks who truly came out ahead never threw a punch. Sit with that as the room goes quiet and the screen goes soft, the strongest man in the multiverse, alone in a garage, talking to a machine he built to sound like the wife who was erased from every reality there is. That is where the show leaves him, more or less, and it is a truer ending than any victory would have been. Thank you for spending this time here in the quiet with me, drifting through the whole sad, clever machinery of it. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.